everybody. So as you guys know, most of you all have joined with your name. For those who haven't joined with the name and audio, let's start with the audio. So when you join on the desktop version, you'll see a headphone option here. So kindly click on the headphone option to join with computer audio. In case you all are joining from phone, once you join by putting the meeting ID, you will either see call in via device audio or call using by internet. This is for iPhone users. This is for other phones. So kindly join the audio. Otherwise, you won't be able to hear what the expert is speaking. So kindly join your audio. And once you join, kindly mute it. There should be a cross red line across it saying that it is muted so that there is less of disturbance or any background sound. Okay, and keep your videos on. There should not be a red cross sign across your video option so that we can have an interactive session. Second thing is to rename yourselves. People who, most of you have renamed yourselves, but those joining in from phone or laptop or device version, kindly click on the participant tab. Go to your name. There will be a rename option. When you take the cursor here, there's a rename option. Kindly rename with your name, your district, your designation. So it is useful for giving attendance by the NHM team. And there is a chat option on the below bar screen. You all can send us the chat. In the phone options, as most of you are connected through phones, you can click on the phone option here. In more, you'll get a chat option. Put your attendance on the chat so that it's easier for us to track it. And you can either send a group chat, to everybody, the questions in the question answer round, or you can just put your chat privately to the hub team members. And just last to end with is mute yourself so that there is less disturbance, so the expert can present well and everybody can hear it well clearly. Please position your webcam correctly. Room should be well lit, and in case you have any question, raise your hand, or you can put your questions on the chat functions so that the expert can take it at the later end.
ഈ ഒരു ട്രെയിനിങ് സെഷൻ കൊണ്ട് നമ്മൾ ഉദ്ദേശിക്കുന്നത് 14 ജില്ലകളിലും ഇനി അങ്ങോട്ടുള്ള നമ്മളുടെ കോവിഡ് മാനേജ്മെന്റിന് പീഡിയാട്രിക് മാനേജ്മെന്റിന് TOTs ആയിട്ട് ഫംഗ്ഷൻ ചെയ്യാനായിട്ട് 14 ജില്ലകളിലേക്കും ആവശ്യത്തിന് ആൾക്കാർ ട്രെയിൻഡ് ആയി മുന്നോട്ട് പോകും എന്നാണ്. അപ്പോൾ എല്ലാ ഡിസ്ട്രിക്ട് നോഡൽ ഓഫീസേഴ്സ് വഴിയും മറ്റ് വിവിധ ഗ്രൂപ്പുകൾ വഴിയും ഇത് ഡിസെമിനേറ്റ് ചെയ്തിട്ടുണ്ട്. ഒരു 30% പെർ ഡിസ്ട്രിക്റ്റ് ആണ് നമ്മൾ എക്സ്പെക്ട് ചെയ്തിരുന്നത്. ആൾക്കാര് ജോയിൻ ചെയ്തുകൊണ്ടിരിക്കുന്നു. ഇപ്പോൾ തന്നെ 120ഓളം ആൾക്കാർ.
എല്ലാവർക്കും നമസ്കാരം. എനിക്ക് തോന്നുന്നു കഴിഞ്ഞ ആഴ്ചത്തെ എക്കോ ട്രെയിനിങ് പ്രോഗ്രാമിന്റെ ഒരു കണ്ടിന്യൂഷൻ ആണ് ഇതെന്നാണ് ഞാൻ മനസ്സിലാക്കുന്നത്. അപ്പൊ അന്ന് ഇതേപോലെ ഒരുപാട് ഡോക്ടർമാർ പങ്കെടുത്തിരുന്നു. എനിക്കൊന്ന് ഇന്ന് നമ്പർ ഒരു ഇത്തിരി കുറവാണോ എന്നൊരു സംശയം. പക്ഷെ വഴിയെ എല്ലാവരും ജോയിൻ ചെയ്യുമെന്ന് പ്രതീക്ഷിക്കുന്നു. എന്തായിരുന്നാലും നമുക്കെല്ലാം അറിയാം, അന്ന് പറഞ്ഞ കുറെ കാര്യങ്ങൾ ചിലപ്പോൾ ഞാൻ പറഞ്ഞ റിപ്പീറ്റ് ഒരേ തള്ളു തന്നെ ആയിരിക്കും. നേരത്തെ കേട്ടവർ സഹിക്കുക. അപ്പോ നമ്മുടെ പറയാതിരിക്കാനും പറ്റില്ലല്ലോ. അതുകൊണ്ടാക്കാം ഈ നമ്മുടെ ഈ COVID-19 മാനേജ്മെന്റിന്റെ ഒരു ഫ്രണ്ട് ലൈൻ വർക്ക് ചെയ്യുന്ന ആളുകളാണ് നിങ്ങളെല്ലാവരും. അപ്പോ ഇനി അങ്ങോട്ട് പോകും തോറും പ്രത്യേകിച്ച് ഓണത്തോടു കൂടി ചിലപ്പോൾ നമുക്ക് കേസുകളുടെ എണ്ണം ഒരുപാട് ഓണത്തിന് ശേഷമുള്ള ആഴ്ചകളിൽ ഒരുപാട് കൂടാൻ സാധ്യതയുണ്ട്. ഏകദേശം സെപ്റ്റംബറിലാണ് നമ്മൾ കൂടുതലും ആളുകൾ ഇതിന്റെ ഒരു പീക്ക് പ്രഡിക്റ്റ് ചെയ്യുന്നതും സെപ്റ്റംബർ ഒക്ടോബറിൽ. അപ്പൊ അതുകൊണ്ട് തന്നെ നമ്മൾ ഇനി വളരെ പ്രിപ്പയർഡ് ആയിട്ടിരിക്കേണ്ട ആളുകളാണ് മുന്നോട്ട് നോക്കുമ്പോൾ കാണുന്നത്. ഈ പ്രിപ്പയർഡ്നെസിന്റെ ഏറ്റവും ഇമ്പോർട്ടന്റ് കോമ്പണന്റ് ആണ് ഡോക്ടേഴ്സ് എന്നുള്ള നിലയ്ക്ക് നിങ്ങൾ ഒരുപാട് പേര് CFLTCയും കോവിഡ് ഹോസ്പിറ്റൽസും ഒക്കെ റൺ ചെയ്യുന്ന കോവിഡ് പേഷ്യൻസിനെ നേരിട്ട് ഹാൻഡിൽ ചെയ്യുന്ന ആളുകളാണ്. അപ്പോൾ ഈ എപ്പിഡമിക്കുമായി ബന്ധപ്പെട്ട് ഏറ്റവും കൂടുതൽ ഫീൽഡ് എക്സ്പീരിയൻസ് ഓൾറെഡി ഉള്ള ആളുകളാണ് നിങ്ങൾ. അപ്പൊ നിങ്ങളുടെ ആ ഒരു എക്സ്പീരിയൻസിന്റെ കൂടെ എങ്ങനെ നിങ്ങളുടെ സ്കിൽസ് അല്ലെങ്കിൽ നിങ്ങളുടെ കുറച്ചുകൂടിയും നിങ്ങളുടെ ഒരു അക്യുമെന്റ് ഷാർപ്പൻ ചെയ്യാം എന്നുള്ളതിനുള്ള ഒരു അറ്റംപ്റ്റ് മാത്രമാണിത്. അപ്പോൾ കഴിഞ്ഞ ആഴ്ചത്തെ മാനേജ്മെന്റ് പ്രോട്ടോകോൾസിനെ കുറിച്ചും പേഷ്യന്റ് ഡയഗ്നോസിസ് ആൻഡ് മാനേജ്മെന്റ് പ്രോട്ടോകോൾസിനെ കുറിച്ചുള്ള ക്ലാസ് വളരെ യൂസ്ഫുൾ ആയിരുന്നു. ഞാനും അത് ഏകദേശം ഫുൾ അറ്റൻഡ് ചെയ്തു. അപ്പോ അന്ന് ഒരുപാട് ക്വസ്റ്റ്യൻസ് ഇതുപോലെ പീഡിയാട്രിക് ഏജ് ഗ്രൂപ്പുമായി ബന്ധപ്പെട്ട് വന്നിരുന്നത് ഞാനും നോട്ടീസ് ചെയ്തു. അപ്പൊ അന്ന് തന്നെ ഡോക്ടർ ദിവ്യ എന്നെ വിളിച്ച് പറഞ്ഞു നമുക്ക് ഇനി പീഡിയാട്രിക്സ് ഫോക്കസ് ചെയ്തുകൊണ്ട് ഒരു ക്ലാസ്സും കൂടി വേണം. അപ്പൊ അതുകൊണ്ടാണ് അതിന്റെ ഒരു ഫോളോ അപ്പ് എന്നുള്ള നിലയ്ക്ക് ഈ സെഷൻ ഇവിടെ നടക്കുന്നതെന്ന് ഞാൻ വിശ്വസിക്കുന്നു. എന്തായാലും ഡോക്ടർ ദിവ്യ പറഞ്ഞതുപോലെ തന്നെ അന്ന് ഡോക്ടർ അരവിന്ദ് ആയിരുന്നെങ്കിൽ ഇന്ന് അതേപോലെ തന്നെ ഇതിനേക്കാൾ ബെറ്റർ ആയിട്ടൊരാൾ നിങ്ങൾക്ക് ഇനി കിട്ടാനില്ല ഈ വിഷയത്തില് ഇതിനെപ്പറ്റി പറഞ്ഞു തരാനായിട്ട്. അപ്പോ ഈ ഫീൽഡിലെ ഏറ്റവും വലിയ എക്സ്പേർട്ടിനെ തന്നെ കൊണ്ടുവരാൻ സാധിച്ചതിൽ ട്രെയിനിങ് ടീമിനെ ഞാൻ അഭിനന്ദിക്കുന്നു. ഷീജ മാഡം പറയുന്ന കാര്യങ്ങൾ വളരെ ശ്രദ്ധിച്ച് കേട്ട് മനസ്സിലാക്കാൻ ശ്രമിക്കുക. ഏറ്റവും എല്ലാത്തിനും ഉപരി കഴിഞ്ഞ പ്രാവശ്യത്തെ പോലെ തന്നെ വളരെ ആക്റ്റീവായിട്ടൊരു ഇന്ററാക്റ്റീവ് സെഷൻ ഇതിനകത്ത് ഉണ്ടാവും ഞാൻ പ്രതീക്ഷിക്കുന്നു. കാരണം അതിന്റെ ഫീഡ്ബാക്ക് വെച്ചിട്ടാണ് ഇപ്പോഴത്തെ ട്രെയിനിങ് പ്ലാൻ ചെയ്തത്. അപ്പൊ ഇന്നത്തെ ഫീഡ്ബാക്ക് വെച്ചിട്ട് വേണം അടുത്ത ട്രെയിനിങ് പ്ലാൻ ചെയ്യാൻ. അങ്ങനെ ഏതൊക്കെ രീതിയിൽ നിങ്ങളെ കൂടുതൽ സ്ട്രെങ്തൻ ചെയ്യാം, അതുപോലെ നമ്മുടെ കേരളത്തിന്റെ COVID-19 പ്രതിരോധത്തിന്റെ ഫ്രണ്ട് ലൈനിനെ എങ്ങനെ ഏറ്റവും സ്ട്രോങ്ങസ്റ്റ് ഫ്രണ്ട് ലൈൻ ആക്കി മാറ്റാം എന്നുള്ളൊരു അറ്റംപ്റ്റിന്റെ ഭാഗമാണ് ഇതെല്ലാം. അപ്പോ ഏറ്റവും ശ്രദ്ധയോടുകൂടി മാഡം പറയുന്നത് കേൾക്കുക. അതിനേക്കാൾ ഉപരി ഏറ്റവും നന്നായി ഇന്ററാക്ട് ചെയ്ത് നിങ്ങളുടെ ഡൗട്ട്സ് എല്ലാം ക്ലിയർ ചെയ്ത് സജഷൻസ് എല്ലാം പറഞ്ഞ് ഇതിൽ നിന്നും അടുത്ത ഒരു ട്രെയിനിങ് നമുക്ക് ഉടനെ പ്ലാൻ ചെയ്യാൻ തക്ക വിധത്തിലുള്ള ഇൻപുട്ട് നിങ്ങൾ തരുമെന്ന് വിശ്വസിക്കുന്നു. എന്തായാലും കൂടുതൽ ദീർഘിപ്പിക്കുന്നില്ല, ഇമ്പോർട്ടന്റ് ആയിട്ടുള്ള കാര്യങ്ങളിലേക്ക് കടക്കാം. മാഡം വെൽക്കം വൺസ് അഗൈൻ. എല്ലാവർക്കും ആദ്യം തന്നെ നന്ദി വെൽക്കം പറയുന്നതിന് മുമ്പ്. ഇത്രയും കാലം പിടിച്ചു നിന്നതിനും നമ്മുടെ കോവിഡ് പ്രതിരോധം ഇത്രയും ശക്തമാക്കിയതിനും ഇനി അങ്ങോട്ടും ഇതേ സ്ട്രെങ്തോടു കൂടി എല്ലാവരും തുടരുമെന്ന് വിശ്വസിക്കുന്നു. അപ്പൊ ഈ ക്ലാസ് എല്ലാവരും ഗംഭീരമായിട്ട് അറ്റൻഡ് ചെയ്യുക. താങ്ക് യു.
First of all, good evening, everybody. And thank you, Dr. Sridham, Dr. Divya, and the NHM team for giving me this opportunity. I'm really obliged for it. So, nere topic lote kadakkana. One thing I would say is I wouldn't be really going into the hardcore critical care aspect because that is going to take another 1 hour. So, I'll stick on to our level 1 and level 2 pediatric care. And I'm welcome and I'm very happy to answer any questions that you want to ask from any end of the COVID that you're going to deal in a pediatric patient. Okay. So coming to the presentation as such, what I plan to cover in the next half an hour or so would be overview is basically, first I'll start with the newborn care. Why I'm starting with the newborn care is newborn is mainly a symptomatic treatment, not really going in much into the pathophysiology. So thought I would start with that. Followed by a bit of pathophysiology, especially what is the reason for the lung injury, the clinical presentation, the treatment guidelines, more stress on how the treatment differs in a child and an adult, including all the parameters. There is a difference. As we always say as pediatricians, child is not a miniature adult. So coming to the newborn care, there have been reports that infection can spread to a newborn child in the intrapartum period or in the antenatal period from the mother to the fetus. But what has been proven till now is in fact the postnatal transmission. So all the other things are just case reports with no very strong scientific basis. So for our practical purpose, we need to know that most of our babies, when they get COVID-19, they are in fact getting infected postnatally through droplet secretions. So having known that, what are the precautions we need to take during delivery? So the delivery precaution is not exactly for the baby, you're trying to prevent an infection in the baby, rather you're trying to get yourself not being infected. So you have to don the complete PPE, including N95, because your bag and mask, you're giving suction, all are aerosol generating procedures. So don't have too many people around the resuscitation area. Try to have as much less people there as possible, preferably not more than 3. And there is nothing for preference for a normal delivery or a cesarean. The risk of transmission remains the same. Coming to the clinical features, most of the medical colleges have had 20 to 30 COVID positive deliveries. But fortunately, the number of babies who were COVID positive was maybe 2 or 3, mostly 1 or 2 only. And thankfully, most of them are usually asymptomatic. It's nothing to really say that it is a COVID respiratory or a COVID systemic infection. But reports are there that they can manifest with respiratory distress, vomiting, diarrhea, just like a bigger child or an adult. But most of them are asymptomatic, thankfully. But the 2 subsets of babies, that is who are born preterm, and those who have underlying disease, maybe underlying heart disease or any other underlying disease, they are definitely at an increased risk of having a higher severity. So we need to be careful for those babies. Okay, now coming to the testing. So what we normally do is we take a nasopharyngeal swab that is 24 hours after birth. Now, why do you want to take it 24 hours after birth? Can you take it before? Even at 24 hours, the chance for false positive and false negative both are there. False positive happens because you know that the baby is in the amniotic fluid, which definitely has the viral particles. So if you take a swab early, you will get a false positive. That is, the baby is not infected, but the amniotic fluid which was positive, you're getting a nasopharyngeal swab positive that way. So that is why you want to delay it after 24 hours. So till now, we were taking only 1 sample. That is one sample after 24 hours. If it is negative, you used to take it as negative. So now the recommendation is you can repeat the second sample. That is on the day when the mother's sample is repeated. And this is one thing I would like to stress. Don't be over enthusiastic for the second sample. What I mean by saying that is, imagine the mother had COVID positivity 7 days before delivery. So the mother is going to be in a normal delivery without any complications, without any incompatibility. You're expecting that the mother is going to be discharged. You want to discharge the mother and baby on the 3rd day. So do you want to repeat your swab in such a scenario on day 3? You have taken at 24 hours. Now do you want to take at 72 hours? Not needed. So only if the mother is there in the hospital for COVID positivity and the mother sample is being repeated when the baby is more than 5 days of age, you can repeat the sample to see if the baby is infected or not. Otherwise, single sample is enough. So now coming to what do you do with the baby once the baby is born? So we already said that the transmission to the baby is going to usually happen through the respiratory route. So does that mean that we should not keep the baby along with the mother? We need to know that lot of benefit is there always with the rooming in of mother and baby, be it in a private sector, be it in a higher socioeconomic, lower socioeconomic. Mother-baby bonding, breast milks are very, very important in the coming days for any baby. So it is important that you allow rooming in because there has been no reported increased risk of transmission. So that's a good news. Even when you're keeping your mother and baby together in the same room, there is no increased risk of transmission. So even if you have the facility, it is better to offer both of them, keep both of them in the same room. But the important thing is all caregiver, including the mother, should wear a mask and practice hand hygiene. So every time you take the baby for feeding, the mother is expected to practice hand hygiene. So transmission can occur even before the symptoms appear. So that is why whether you're symptomatic or not is not the question. You need to follow the guideline of wearing a mask and practicing hand hygiene. And as usual, we earlier also said, babies with underlying disease and preterms are higher risk. So you need to be a little more careful regarding them. Now, how long do you continue this for eternally? How long would you plan that the baby needs to be kept away from the mother, or mother need to wear the mask when she's dealing with her baby, do the hand hygiene every time she's taking the baby? How long? So usually if it's a mild illness, more than 10 days since the first there is more than 10 days since the first symptom, the mother can be allowed to handle the baby in a routine way. Or more than 20 days if the mother had severe symptoms. So if the onset of symptoms or the disease was severe, you are expecting the viral shedding may last for a longer time. So you are asking the mother to follow all precautions till 20 days of the onset of disease. And there should not be any fever, and the mother should be feeling symptomatically better. So this is not only one. That means all the 4 criteria should be fulfilled. Only then you take it as the mother is unlikely to transmit and the mother can feed the baby. Not feed the baby. Feeding the baby is happening even before that. This is, you don't have to take a special precaution as if the mother is COVID positive. You can just take it as a routine care. This we all, and one more to add is that usually the CDC is recommending that the baby should be kept away from the mother, 6 feet distance, but usually we are not practicing that. We are allowing rooming in and we are allowing the baby to be with the mother itself. Now coming to the disease process in a child. So coming to pathogenesis, what exactly happens the disease? As we all know, the virus is entering the body through the ACE receptors, and the virus itself is responsible for the many of the clinical manifestations. That is, ACE receptors are there in your lung, ACE receptors are there in your GI tract. So that is why 10% are going to present to you with the GI symptoms like diarrhea, vomiting, and you also have respiratory symptoms. But we also know that it is not only the virus that is responsible for the protein manifestations of COVID. On the other side, you may have a cytokine storm. That means your body is responding to virus, but unfortunately, it is responding in a very violent manner with a lot of cytokines, interleukins, tumor necrosis factors getting synthesized, and they are now damaging your body rather than the virus itself. So these are the 2 pathological mechanisms by which the body is damaged. So it is important for us to understand these 2 because our treatment depends on these 2 factors. And why are children having lesser manifestation? Nobody exactly knows, but one of the main reasons postulated is, one is you have less number of ACE receptors, so less chance of the virus entering the body and causing a severe disease. And the other is naturally a weak immune system, an immature immune system may not be manifesting as much as an older child, but that cannot be validated because children do come with multi-inflammatory syndromes. So now coming to the cause of hypoxia. We all know that when we say about management of patients with COVID, we are more bothered about the respiratory management. So for us to understand what to provide a child for a respiratory manifestations that the patient is having, and we need to know that what causes hypoxia. So that is important. So what causes hypoxia? You're going to have usually a ventilation perfusion mismatch. So that means initially when the virus is entering your body, you have, usually your lung has a propensity that wherever there is less oxygen, there will be less blood flow. Wherever there is more oxygen, there will be more blood flow. So that is how the ventilation perfusion match is maintained. Here what happens, this hypoxic vasoconstriction does not happen. There is a global hyperperfusion. So this hyperperfusion means that that part of the lung which does not have much of air, that means your basal parts of the lung, even there the circulation is more. So there is a hypoxia happening there. This usually is happening in the initial period of infection. That is a ventilation perfusion mismatch due to hyperperfusion. The next stage is your pulmonary capillaries are getting damaged, the endothelium is getting damaged, there is a thrombophlebitis because of the viral infection, which is acting as a nidus for thrombus formation, and because of which you are having thrombosis in the pulmonary vessels in the lung. Naturally, when you don't have a blood flowing into a particular part of the lung, that area will not be able to transmit the oxygen to the blood vessel. So that's the second stage. So here earlier you had hyperperfusion, now you have having regional hypoperfusion, again causing a ventilation perfusion mismatch. There was also an initial study telling that the virus also interferes with a heme metabolism. It dissociates the iron from the heme. We all know that iron is needed for the carrying of oxygen. So that is also responsible for decreased oxygen carrying capacity of your blood in a COVID infection. So as you see, there are various reasons why the hypoxia is happening. So depending on the cause why your patient is hypoxic, we should understand the rationale for us providing the treatment. So as you see, fortunately, the confirmed cases in children, even though range from 2 to 10%, but most of the studies say it is around 1.5 to 2%. So that's a good news. That is, the chance of a baby getting or a child getting infected with COVID-19 is less. But you should know that these studies basically means that these are children who were symptomatic. So you really don't know the number of asymptomatic children who are COVID positive, because we now know that because we are screening all patients who come in contact with the positive patient, we are getting a lot of children with COVID positive, but thankfully they are not symptomatic. So the disease, as I earlier said, it is milder and lesser in children, but we need to understand that they are very important source of transmission. You cannot make a child wear a mask. Whenever he feels like, he'll remove the mask. Whenever he wants to cough, he would cough right on your face. So they are very important source of transmission as well as infection to the family members, the close contacts, including the healthcare workers. So adults, we know that 80% are mild, another 15% moderate, and 5% are critical. Fortunately, in children, only 0.5% become critical. So you do get moderate illnesses, but critical illnesses are definitely rarer in children compared to adults. So now coming to the clinical presentation. So what is important for us to know that even though it is a viral infection, you find that the respiratory symptoms, that is upper respiratory symptoms like rhinorrhea is very rare. Anosmia may be there, which is very, very marked symptom that you have earlier. 10% will present to you with diarrhea and vomiting. Fatigue may be important part, sore throat. So those are the symptoms that you commonly see in a child or an adult with COVID. So the clinical presentation does not have much of a difference. Then we know how do you differentiate? How would you understand by the difference in infection between a COVID and say your measles or Ebola? The Ebola was highly, the death mortality was very high, but Ebola was mainly a droplet spread. A droplet spread means the chance of it spreading in an environment does not happen at longer distance. It is only within 6 feet or within 3 feet, in fact, more precisely. Whereas measles is an aerosol spread which can spread very rapidly through the air to patients sitting quite far from the contact sitting very far from the patient if it is in the same room. So unfortunately, now we know that our COVID has both droplet as well as aerosol spread. So when you're wearing a mask and the patient is also wearing a mask, the droplet spread can be prevented to a great extent. The aerosolization can also be prevented. So it is very important for us to understand that you wearing the mask alone is not enough, the patient also. So even if it's a child, the child requires a mask so that when he's coughing, he's not generating much of droplets and aerosols. But masks are not recommended for children below 2 years of age, because you know that baby may not be having a protective instinct, may sleep off, may go for suffocation. So you can only think of providing it only for children more than 2 years of age. We'll come to certain methods by which you can decrease the aerosolization also. Now, coming to the difference between your standard influenza, say H1N1, whatever, the seasonal influenza and the COVID, you find here that the reproductive number of COVID is high. So what do you understand by reproductive number? We all know if one person gets COVID, the chance of another, the transmission risk is you will be infecting another 2 to 4 patients. Whereas in influenza, the chance of another getting an infection from you is very less. Similarly, you find that the incubation period in COVID is a wide range from 1 to 14 days. And the hospitalization rate, we say that the mortality is only less than 2%. But you should know that its mortality is definitely more high, much higher than case fatality rate of influenza, which is less than 0.1%. So what we tend to compare is you're comparing with severe disease like your MERS-CoV, which you had, the Middle East respiratory syncytial virus, or you're comparing with Ebola and you're telling that the mortality is less. But otherwise, it definitely is a high. Contagiousness is the most difficult problem of it, but those who get admitted, we do are finding a rising mortality rate. So now coming to the clinical progression, the disease can manifest in 3 forms. Hyperacute, that means suddenly the patient develops fever and the symptoms are quite significant for them. Then commonly you have a moderate occurrence. That means it starts with small symptoms. You have a dry cough, you have a sore throat, and then progresses to have a fever. Then early symptoms, you may have agnosia and edusia, that is taste and smell is lost. Then slowly the cough increases, and then you progress. So that is one method of having. So you can have a hyperacute, you can have a moderate, and then you can have a biphasic response. So biphasic means initially you felt that the child was having a little fever, sore throat, cough, and then the fever subsided and you were happy that the child or the patient is improving. But unfortunately, after a little bit of another, you find that the child goes on to have worsening of respiratory distress with multi-organ involvement and with multi-organ failure also. So that is because the second half is because of the cytokine storm that is happening. So you can have 3 modes of presentation in any patient with COVID. So the important thing for us to understand is that the breathlessness is developing after 6 to 7 days of onset of disease. So that means unlike influenza, where you have the onset itself, you have high fever, body ache, you're feeling sick, it doesn't happen in COVID. COVID usually is starting mild and then progressively develops. By the end of the 1 week, you're developing breathlessness. And after you're developing a breathlessness on exertional dyspnea, it takes another 6 to 7 days. Finally, you land up in an ICU. So that is very, very important for us to understand. So even if the patient develops a fever and you find that the patient is better on the day 2 or 3, you need to keep the patient under the loop to look for if the patient is worsening subsequently or not. And anybody who has a respiratory symptom needs to be closely monitored for worsening of symptom. And the first initial symptoms, unlike your classical pneumonia, where the patient will be telling you, will be running high fever, will be having wet cough, here by that time the cough is starting, often the fever has come down and you are having dry cough. But what is characteristic and what you should be looking for is exertional dyspnea. When the patient is going to bathroom, is the distress increasing? Is the saturation coming down after small exertions? Because that is the time you're really picking up the ventilation perfusion mismatch. So that becomes very important for us to know. So this, I think you already know that whom to suspect and whom to test. That is anybody with an influenza-like illness or a GI symptoms coming from an area with a community transmission or a travel history, you need to test. All healthcare workers with influenza-like insurance, patients developing ILI in hospital. That is, a patient is admitted with some other disease but develops an upper respiratory infection in the hospital, you need to test them. If 2 or more family members, even if they are not coming from a containment zone, you have an influenza-like illness, he needs to be tested. And all confirmed cases and all patients before surgeries also we routinely test. So how do you manage from the point of time the patient is coming? So what we normally do is, if the patient is coming from a high-risk zone, you are asking them to go directly to the COVID isolation area. Otherwise also, when the patient is coming, if it is from the critical containment zone, or if the patient is having a respiratory symptoms, what we commonly do is, we admit them in a separate respiratory ward or a high-risk ward. From there, you are doing an antigen screening, and if the antigen screening is negative, then you decide where to put the child, whether you want to put it in the general ward or you want to go to the COVID area. So you are having multiple layers or multiple steps of triaging, so that you're trying to pick up as many positive cases as possible, decreasing the mingling of infected patients with non-infected patients, because we know that the infectivity is high. So at all points, we have to see to it that the transmission as far as possible is reduced. So what is really recommended is the moment you identify a patient having a suspected COVID, you have to see that the patient is wearing a proper mask. And what is really recommended is a triple layer mask for the patient as well as for the caretaker who is with the baby. So that if possible, it has to be provided. So now coming to the treatment per se. So treatment per se, we all know category. So we usually divide the patients into three. Category A is someone with a very mild symptoms. As you all know, diarrhea, vomiting, sore throat, occasional cough. Category B would be someone who's developed a fever, whose sore throat becomes bitter more, then cough is increasing. So these are the patients you really want to admit in the hospital itself and monitor them. Then category C, to have anyone with a tachypnea, with a respiratory distress, with the organ involvement, they all come under category C. So you don't have a problem with that. You should understand that both category A and B are just upper respiratory infections. So even when they are having cough, it is just a dry cough. There is no respiratory distress, there is no tachypnea. It is the category C that is providing with your lower respiratory infection or other organ involvement. So category C, in fact, has two subgroup of patients. One is the moderate clinical severity, that is somebody with tachypnea or somebody with a little hypoxia, your saturation between 90 to 94%, or somebody with a critical disease, that is when the saturation is less than 90 or the patient has danger signs, the baby is not able to feed. So it is important to understand that danger signs in a child, unlike an adult who will verbalize what he's feeling, your baby may not say. So if you find that the baby is unusually quiet, or if you find that the baby is unusually irritable, the baby is not sucking at the breast, that is a very important danger sign. Look for tachypnea, look for grunting, look for poor activity, look for inability to feed, look for breastfeeding difficulty, or look for any head sweating that is happening when the baby is feeding, or the tachypnea that is developing after a breastfeed, which means that the baby is having an exertional dyspnea. So those kind of subtle symptoms we have to be really looking for, seeking for those signs. So we know that now clinical severity, you have mild, moderate, and severe. So according to our state classification of category A, B, and C, both category A and B come under mild clinical severity. Category C includes both moderate severity as well as severe severity. So that is important for us to know. And all category C patients, whether it is a moderate severity or severe and critical will naturally go to a tertiary care center, but all moderate cases should also go to a tertiary care center because high risk of worsening is there. So now coming to management. So category A, it is always a symptomatic management. Symptomatic management, what we need to remember is that if the patient is having a previous history of asthma and the child is on a bronchodilator or inhalers, ask them to continue the inhalers. Do not offer nebulization. Nebulization, even though not proven that it is completely aerosol generating, it is considered as a high aerosol generating procedure. So commonly not recommended. You are recommending a face mask with a spacer for anybody with obese. And these children with category A, you need to monitor every 24 to 48 hours. So what are you monitoring for these patients? You're monitoring for any worsening of symptoms. If the fever is increasing, if the fever has appeared, if the cough is worsening, if the sore throat is worsening, if the general condition does not feel good, that means the patient has moved on to category B and needs to be taken care of at a treating center rather than at a CFNTC. So now coming to category B. Category B means a patient had a fever and the cough is increasing, the sore throat is worsening, or a patient of the category A with a comorbidity. So usually you will start these patients because they are having an influenza-like illness with oseltamivir till your results are available. So nowadays you are doing an antigen study. So you get the results at then and there. So, but you will also have those subset of patients, those who are admitted with an antigen negative, and then you send the RT-PCR and then you get an RT-PCR positive. So whatever be the situation, if at the admission the diagnosis is not confirmed and it is an influenza-like illness which requires a treatment, you start them on oseltamivir. But once the diagnosis is confirmed, you stop oseltamivir and you start them on HCQ plus azithromycin. Now there is a controversy there. So our guidelines still stick on to this combination, but we need to know that It is mandatory that you take an ECG before that to look for QT prolongation. It is also important for us to understand that the government of India no more supports this combination. They still continue to recommend HCQ. They are not really recommending HCQ plus azithromycin. So we may continue the HCQ alone also. So imagine you have the patient came, the child had a category B symptom. You started oseltamivir. After an RT-PCR now is taking 2 to 3 days for you to get the result. And you got the result on the 2nd or 3rd day. By that time, the fever has subsided. Now the question is, do you want to start him on HCQ? The answer is no. So when you are getting the result, what is the category of your patient? If the patient continues to be in category B, definitely HCQ. If the patient is not in category B and now has moved on to category A, no need to start HCQ. And the your supportive care remains the same. And remember, diarrhea, vomiting, it is important that you give zinc. It is important that you ask them to take electrolyte-rich fluid. It's important to see that the urine output is good. You're asking them to take ORS. All those things are very important, just like in a routine child. Now coming to the category C. That means you are having moderate or severe disease. That means either the patient is having tachypnea or the patient has got saturation less than 94%. So there is one difference here. The category B, you should understand, adults, we have moved on to favipiravir because you want to start the antiviral earlier when the viral multiplication is still happening in your body. But favipiravir is not recommended or not licensed for use in pediatrics either by the DGCI or by the FDA. So we have not recommended favipiravir in our guidelines. But if your medical board feels so, it may be given. That's only after concurrence with the patient as well as with the treating medical board. The reason being that favipiravir is it's a teratogenic drug, and it has been in growing mice. It has been found to cause some problems in the muscles. So that is why we are not recommending favipiravir. So you don't have a universal dose also. You only have certain case reports of it being used in Ebola. So that is why category B, in adults, you are giving favipiravir. In children, we are not recommending favipiravir. We are sticking on with HCQ. In category C, that means your respiratory symptoms are there. So this is the time you definitely want to get the virus out of your system and you want to give an antiviral. So what is now recommended is remdesivir, that is 5 mg per kg IV as a loading dose, which is given as an infusion over 32 minutes to 120 minutes, that is 2 hours, followed by 2.5 mg per kg IV once daily for 2 to 4 days. In case remdesivir is not available, then you can definitely give HCQ or azithro combination or HCQ plus lopinavir ritonavir combination. So here, you should understand that lopinavir ritonavir combination is no more recommended in adults because it has not been found to be much useful. But the recommendation for pediatric use continues to be there. Here again, the preferred is remdesivir. If it is not available and the child is sick and is having respiratory symptoms, you go for that. But along with that, we need to understand that we will be, so category C patients, you will be also starting methylpred or DEXA and low molecular weight heparin if there is no contraindication. So don't be scared about using an enoxaparin in a child because it's a safer drug. If the child does not otherwise have a risk for bleeding, it does not require stringent monitoring and can be safely given. It is one thing that we commonly use in our ICU settings. Now coming to why do you want to give a methylpred and a low molecular weight heparin? So now we should understand that the lung in COVID can be of 2 types. The one is we already said. That is, we already said that the hypoxia is initially happening due to hyperperfusion or it is happening because a thrombus is forming. So what do you mean by that? The problem is in the vasculature and not inside your alveoli. So your alveoli is free, but there is either too much blood in the hypoventilated area or there is too little blood in the ventilated area, because of which you are not getting oxygen into your system. So here, what do you need to do? Here, all you need to do is provide them with adequate oxygen. So whatever little blood is reaching the areas which is ventilated carries the maximum oxygen along with it. So this is what happens in the beginning of a COVID infection. So this is what you call it as an L type of lung. That is, the lung alveoli inside is normal. It is the capillary or the vasculature which is having the problem. Then as the disease later you can have an H type of lung. H type of lung is the classical ARDS lung. So what is happening here? Your capillary endothelium is damaged. Your alveolar epithelium is damaged. So all your proteinaceous material is getting exuded into the alveoli. Your lung has become wet. And on top of that, your surfactant has gone. So there is your alveoli are getting collapsed. So on one side, you have a dry lung. On the other side, you are having a wet lung. So you should understand that these two are not mutually exclusive. What do I mean by that? I'm not telling that one child will have a L type of lung and the other will have an H type. You should know that patient may have an L type injury to the lung and may recover from that, or may progress from L type to H type. So it can be a spectrum. It can be the continuation of the same spectrum that you are moving from one form to other. So what is our aim now? We want to see that the L type of lung remains L type and does not progress to H type. We also want to see that if your alveoli is not bad, your aim should be to provide more oxygen rather than providing more pressure. And if your alveoli is wet, if your lung is wet, you have to do something to keep the alveoli open so that the oxygenation happens. Now, having said that, what does it clinically mean? It clinically means that the clinical presentation, you can have hypoxia without respiratory distress. So which is the patient who's going to have a hypoxia without respiratory distress? The patient whose alveoli is normal, but the vasculature is abnormal. He is going to present to you not with a wet cough. He will have a dry cough, but he will have an exertional dyspnea. When you look for the saturation, especially after an exertion, you'll find that the saturation is low. Or subsequently, even when the patient is resting, will have a saturation abnormal, but you might not have much of lung signs. So that is the L type of lungs clinical presentation. As it progresses, you will have hypoxia with respiratory distress. And finally, you have the cytokines getting released also from the damaged lung as well as from other parts of your body, which is in turn damaging other organs in your body. So having said that, now coming to the treatment. So when coming to the treatment, we say it should be SAS. What do you mean by SAS? SAS is it should be safe for the patient and safe for the healthcare provider. And it should be appropriate. It should be right. What is rightly needed, it should be given. That means you should not be fumbling at that time. You should already have planned that how you are going to manage the patient, and it should be swift. So even though this is a pandemic, even though this is a disease with a high infectivity, you need to ensure the safeness as well as the swiftness. So for that, what we need to know, we need to be prepared beforehand. So early preparedness will ensure that we are safe, the patient is safe, and the patient is getting the treatment at the right point. So how do we achieve that? So whenever you get a baby with a respiratory distress, first is you have to offer oxygen. So how do you offer oxygen? Usually we prefer to give it through an NRM. The advantage of a non-rebreathing mask is that, as you know, because it is a mask, even if the baby is coughing, the chance of having a droplet and aerosol exposure is less. At the same time, an NRM can provide you with a very high FiO2, 80 to 90%. So the hypoxia will be easily taken care of. And while you are doing this, it is important that you are on a complete safe PPE, especially with an N95 mask that is mandatory with a eye protection. So now imagine you have initially given a mask, whether it's an NRM or whatever, and then you should realize that oxygen is not your friend always. Oxygen can also harm. So how do you know that the oxygen harms you? Why do you say oxygen harms you? You need to understand this. In the normal air that is you're taking in, 21% is only oxygen. Rest of 78% is nitrogen. So what is the nitrogen doing there? This nitrogen is not going to get absorbed into your body. But this nitrogen is important because when you are, even if you are hypoxic and if you're taking the oxygen in, the nitrogen is there, which is going to prevent the collapse of alveoli. So when your lung is damaged and you're giving only 100% oxygen, if you're putting a lung which is not much damaged and you put somebody on a non-rebreathing mask and you're having a saturation of 100%, hyperoxia can damage the respiratory epithelium. In fact, the vital capacity starts decreasing by 6 to 12 hours if you're on 100% oxygen. This itself will cause free radical injury. This will damage your capillary, your epithelium of the respiratory system. It will cause something called absorption atelectasis because there is no inert gas there. If the oxygen gets absorbed, your alveoli just collapses. So 100% oxygen itself can be damaging to the lung. So unless the patient is hypoxic, we should not be over enthusiastic in providing oxygen. So that is why we always say that Start your oxygen only if the saturation is less than 94%. And once you have started the oxygen, you also have a target. You want to keep the SpO2 between 92 to 96%. Don't be happy with the 100% oxygen, because 100% SpO2 means your PaO2 can be 80, your PaO2 can be 400. You do not know. So PaO2 400 will be definitely harmful. So that is two important points that you need to understand. That is, anybody with a saturation less than 94% should be offered an oxygen, but you also have a target SpO2 of 92 to 96%. Now, how do you achieve this target? Your target can be achieved by you deciding which is the way you want to provide oxygen. So initially we said that when you're receiving the child, you're putting an NRM. So after you put the NRM, you find the saturation is 100. So you decide, no, okay, this child does not require an NRM. I better give an oxygen which is less FiO2. So otherwise also you should know that babies are not comfortable with mask. You put the mask on the baby, they'll be just removing it. They're not happy with it. But if you put a prongs and just fix it on, while you're putting, they may be a little irritable. But once it is there, they're happy. They'll just remain with that. So we always, as a pediatricians, we are more happy putting a nasal prongs rather than putting a face mask. So the first oxygen intervention would be putting a nasal prongs. Usually 2 to 4 liters per minute is given. This will give you an FiO2 of 20 to 40%. So when you're keeping a nasal prongs and your saturation is 92, 93, be happy. That means you need to continue with that. If your saturation is not adequate with a nasal prong, option is you can use a face mask because it gives you a higher FiO2. If still the oxygenation is not getting maintained, then you can provide a non-rebreathing mask. Or in pediatrics, I would say that rather than going for a non-rebreathing mask, it is good to have an oxygen hood. Because in newborns, you know how baby is very comfortable with an oxygen hood. So oxygen hood, you have to but use 5 liters per minute, especially when you're using the small hoods. If it's a bigger child and you're having a bigger hood, you can use 3 liters per minute. The 5 liters per minute is to ensure that the carbon dioxide is going out. But when you are using a bigger hood, that means the chance of carbon dioxide retention is also less. Advantage of oxygen hood is that this, again, the chance of aerosolization and droplet spread will be less. And we all know that if both the side ports are open, it provides 30% FiO2. If one side port is open, it provides 60%. And if both side ports are closed, it provides close to 90%. So you can titrate your oxygen from 30 to 90% using an oxygen hood. So this is especially useful in a smaller child or in an infant, it will be very useful. So one thing you need to know that what I have written, where do you use this? You're using this for a hypoxic child with minimal interactions. That means happy hypoxia. Patient is comfortable, but when you are looking at having a little bit of exertional dyspnea, the saturation is not okay, but otherwise more or less the baby is happy. So that is the time you're trying to use increase oxygen delivery, because routinely you're not going to find in ICU baby sitting with an oxygen hood or a baby on non-rebreathing mask. Anybody on a nasal prong, if it's not responding well, you go to a bubble CPAP, and if not responding, you go to an NIV and straight away go for intubation rather than moving on to non-rebreathing mask. But COVID is a special situation where we said that the hypoxia is happening to a vascular abnormality and not due to an alveolar abnormality in the initial stages of the disease, and post-ventilation, the mortality is much higher. That is why you want to see if the baby is comfortable, you want to give a non-invasive oxygen method. Now, what more can you do to decrease the aerosol generation? Remember, crying is an aerosol generating procedure and your baby is naturally going to cry. So that should always be in mind. So it's always better that you fix the prongs and then switch on the oxygen flow meter. So that is a little tricky because you know our oxygen flow meters, what it happens when you open, it just comes under a burst, it may come. So first open and see it is okay, then decrease and then fix the nasal prongs and then connect it to the cylinder so that aerosolization is less. If it's a bigger child, on top of the oxygen prongs, you can give them a triple layer mask so that again aerosolization is less. If it's a smaller child, you can provide them with the oxygen hood, but you're not connecting the oxygen, you're just keeping as a protective barrier. Instead of putting a mask, you can put the triple layer mask on the side of a hood. So again, that will decrease your aerosolization. So that is what we try to do for decreasing droplet spread as well as aerosol spread to the other patients in the ICU or in the ward as well as healthcare workers. Now, if the patient is not responding, don't go bother about the PaO to FiO2 ratio written. Should not be bothered about it. I really don't want anyone to send a blood gas and decide the PaO2 and decide what you're going to do. Just go clinically, just look at the patient. So what are you monitoring? You're monitoring only two parameters, the work of breathing as well as the saturation. If work of breathing is less and saturation is less, then you try to escalate your oxygen therapy. If your work of breathing is more, even if the saturation is normal, you will need to escalate your oxygen therapy. So what are the other options you have if the child is not responding to the before mentioned oxygen therapy devices? So you can use a Jackson-Rees with a face mask. Jackson-Rees is something smaller than a Bain circuit. So here you are fixing this mask to the baby's face and allowing the baby to breathe. So this way it provides you with some PEEP as well as oxygenation. So this is not something that we routinely use. This is very common in Chennai. They are very happy using this, especially in ICH Chennai. But this we may require if the patient load goes up. So we need to explore everything possible. So what is the advantage of Jackson-Rees? It provides you with PEEP. It provides you with 100% oxygen. So it is useful if your other modalities are not available. And the chance of aerosol is also less by this method. Then what has really caught everybody's fancy is the HFNC. That is the high flow nasal cannula. Now, what is exactly this? So what is this? You should understand that this is a device which is providing heated, humidified oxygen to the baby. It is now used in adults also. So because your oxygen that you are providing is heated and humidified, a large flow can be given. So when you're using a nasal prongs, you can give only 2 to 4 liters per minute. When you're giving an HFNC, you can give 25 liters per minute. If it's an adult, you can give 50 to 60 liters per minute. So just because it is humidified, it does not damage your capillary, your endothelium or your ciliary epithelium in the lungs, and it can be given. So this is a very good method, non-invasive method of delivering oxygen to a patient with COVID, especially the one we said where the lung is not really bad is the oxygenation that you have. It's very comfortable for the patient. Of all the oxygen devices that we said before, this is the most comfortable one, but it has its limitations. It does not have a battery backup. So you may have connected the baby to the equipment and very happy, the current goes off, it just switches it off. So that is one drawback. So when you're using, be sure that you have around the clock current, and in case the electricity goes off, go and see that your machine is working, or you need to read this thing. You can have a UPS there as a bridge gap measure. And how do you do it? There are no hi-fi technology in this using this machine. All you have is 3 things: the temperature, the FiO2, and the flow. Now the temperature is set by the equipment, so you don't have to set that. FiO2 depends upon the flow of oxygen that you are keeping, but FiO2 will be displayed on the instrument. So when you're increasing the flow, you can see whether the display is increasing or not. So depending upon the SpO2 of the patient, we already said the saturation you want is 92 to 96%. So the FiO2 that is needed to give a saturation of 92%, you will keep. So no doubt regarding that also. So you're looking at the SpO2 and deciding the FiO2. Then the third part is the flow rate. So that is the only thing that you're really manipulating in this child. So what is normally recommended is 2 liters per minute. So many patients, they will just directly keep the baby on 2 liters per minute. That means if you have a 5 kg child, you're starting with 10 liters per minute. But in COVID, we know that HFNC is also an aerosol generating procedure, because as we already said, you're giving too much of flow. So when you're giving too much of flow, naturally it will cause an aerosol generation. So what is recommended is start with 0.5 liter per kg per minute. Every 15 minutes, observe the child. What are you observing? You're not looking exactly at the SpO2. You're looking at the work of breathing. You are looking at the heart rate. If you find that the heart rate is decreasing, the work of breathing is decreasing, be happy with the 0.5 liter per kg per minute of flow. If you find that the respiratory rate is not decreasing, you increase to 1 liter per kg per minute. If it's not increasing, you increase to 1.5 or you increase to 2 liter per kg per minute. I hope that is clear. You're starting at 0.5 liter per kg per minute, monitoring the child every 15 minutes. You're monitoring for the SpO2 as well as the work of breathing and the respiratory rate and heart rate. SpO2 can be titrated with FiO2. So flow mainly depends upon your work of breathing, that is your respiratory rate and heart rate. So if the patient is not showing improvement, you increase the flow. If the patient is showing improvement, you just keep it there. Then you can also, again, you can use an aerosol box for that and reassess after 1 hour. So you are initially titrating every 15 minutes. And once you have titrated, you observe the patient for 1 hour. If by 1 hour the child has settled down, that means settle down does not mean that these things are disappearing. Settle down means that baby has showing some improvement. If the baby was breathing at 70 per minute, now at 1 hour, the baby is breathing at 60 per minute, then wait, the baby is showing some improvement. But if there is no improvement, the saturation is not maintained, the tachypnea is persisting, the grunt is worsening, that means you should not be trying to again play around with the machine. The child requires an escalation of respiratory support. So now, and this instrument, and another thing I want to tell you is that regarding this instrument, it is not the instrument cost at when you're buying it. The problem is it's reusables, even though in fact the tubings are more costlier than the ventilator tube, disposable tubings, and the nasal prong is also costly. So the cost factor becomes a little bit worrisome for us when you're using on a mass use. And of course, if we had ETO sterilization, we could have thought of reusing also. So now this is the flow meter. So when you're using a preterm or a newborn, the maximum flow that you keep is 8 liters per minute. When it is an infant, the maximum flow that you reach is 20 liters per minute. And beyond infancy, it is 25 liters per minute. So we need to know the maximum flow rate. Adult, it can go to 50 to 60 liters per minute. But adult, you should know that every age group is having a different cannula size. And you don't have to mug it up. When you get the cannula, it is written, whether it is for preterm, it is for term, or it is for an infant, or it is for the child. You can look at that itself, and then you can put the, but you need to select, they are in fact color coded. So if it's a red one, you know, it's for the preterm, the yellow one is for the newborn, the violet one is for the infant, and the green is for the pediatric. The machine is same for adult and the Airvo 2, you can use both for adult and pediatrics. But the settings, when you change, then naturally the flow rate also changes. When you're on a pediatric mode, it will not go beyond 25 liters per minute. Now coming to if the child does not respond to HFNC. Now what is your next option that you have? That means you have to go for a non-invasive ventilation. So when again I am telling you, when I say no response, it does not mean just saturation. It also means work of breathing. We are bothered if the work of breathing is persisting, even if the saturation is maintained, because there is something called PCL, that is patient-induced self-inflicted lung injury. So even if your saturation is good, if you have very bad work of breathing, what does it do? It increases the transalveolar pressure, the pulmonary pressures between the inside and outside. The difference is more because of the work of breathing. That change in pressure, in fact, damages the capillary epithelium, the alveolar epithelium. There will be exudation of fluid into the lung, and what was initially the L-type lung becomes an H-type lung. So increased work of breathing itself can damage your lung and lead to progression of the disease from a normal alveoli to an abnormal alveoli. So it is important to see that the patient, if the patient has work of breathing, we need to provide appropriate escalation of respiratory support so that the patient is not harming his own lung. So if HFNC is not working, what do you have the next option? The next option is going for a non-invasive ventilator. But unfortunately, the traditional non-invasive ventilator, that is the single limb ventilators that you have, it just looks like a nebulization chamber, is not recommended in case of COVID. The reason is single limb means you are exhaling to the environment. So using a mask which has got an port by which you exhale to the environment, the machine is only giving the air for inhalation. So if you're exhaling to the environment, that means you're causing a lot of damage, a lot of aerosolization to the environment where the patient is. So that is why this traditional NIVs are not recommended. So if you want to give a non-invasive ventilation, use the traditional ventilator. That means which has got an inspiratory limb as well as an expiratory limb, so that the expiration is happening through the expiratory limb. It is going to the ventilator where you have put a bacterial filter and a viral filter, so that it is not allowing the virus to escape into the environment. So that is what we prefer when you're using for an NIV. So you're using a traditional ventilator to provide NIV. So what are the precautions that you take? As I already said, near the exhalation, you want to keep a viral filter, and mask, you want to keep an oronasal mask. You don't want to have a nasal mask. So when you're having a nasal mask, you're coughing. So again, you will be causing an aerosolization. And use the minimum pressures. You don't want to have beautiful FiO2s. You don't want to have beautiful graphs. What you are really aiming at is an optimum FiO2, optimum SpO2, optimum work of breathing at the minimum intervention. That is a principle, in fact, whenever you're managing. It is not only for COVID. Whenever you're invasively managing also, you're not really want to give the highest pressures and the highest SpO2s. You want to have a moderate SpO2, moderate pressure with minimum damage to the lung. So that should always be our aim. So that is why we say use minimum pressure. If your patient can be managed on NIV CPAP mode, that is best, because CPAP mode will have less aerosolization. BiPAP mode will have a little more aerosolization. So CPAP mode not responding, you can go to the BiPAP mode. Again, when you are on NIV, you can use an aerosol box on top of it so that aerosolization is less. There's one word I would like to say, unlike in adults, NIV in a pediatric patient is highly aerosolization, because those who have used NIV, you would know that the baby is never going to allow you to keep the NIV for a long time. It just rolls its head, it just pulls it down or pushes it down, and you will always find that the mask is moving out. You end up fixing it again and again, and every time you're fixing it or every time it is getting loose, a lot of air comes out. So a bigger child comes. So it is important that you're having a good seal. It's important that you're keeping the baby calm. It's important that you are continuing with the nutrition. You're seeing that the baby is not having any kind of pain. You're keeping the baby comfortable. All these small things of keeping baby comfortable, keeping baby hydrated, keeping baby fed, seeing that he's not having any extra vegetations are important in your final management of the child. So now, meanwhile, your investigations, we haven't discussed about the investigations. So anybody in the category B or category C, you need to send the investigations. So first you're sending the blood routine. In adults, we all know that you're looking for the neutrophil to the lymphocyte ratio. So 85% of the adults will have lymphopenia, and that is considered as a bad prognostic marker. But unfortunately, only 3.5% of children will have lymphopenia. So CBC does not help you guide prognosticate disease in case of children. But you should know that even in children, if there is lymphopenia, the chance of the child going in for a respiratory support is higher. Definitely send for organ functions. More than the RFT, you're bothered about the transaminases going up, but definitely hydrate them well so that the renal failure is not ticking in. By once in 48 to 72 hours, we need to send CRP, D-dimer, LDH, CPK, ferritin. It looks too much of investigations. So whatever your facility allows, CRP is mandatory every 48 hours, because that's a good marker that an inflammatory storm is setting in. And the next, I would say D-dimer. Ferritin helps you. LDH and CPK, I wouldn't really recommend that way. But CRP mandatory, D-dimer and ferritin, if you have, you definitely need to send 48 to 72 hours. Cardiac function needs to be assessed. Imaging, we should understand that even when you don't have clinical symptoms, the chest X-ray may pick up a patch. And even when the chest X-ray is not picking up a patch, your CT may pick up a patch. But for all practical purpose, the management is mainly clinical. So don't be too much obsessed with investigations, but needs to be taken when needed. Then why we are bothered about it? This is the earlier study from China itself. You can see that all those who had mortality or who did bad, in fact, for them, from the beginning itself, the ferritin, interleukin 6, the TROP-T was elevated and the lymphocyte count was lower. So it is important that even when the child is presenting in category B, if you have a baseline investigation, it sometimes helps you to predict if the child is going to worsen or not. Now, coming to intubation indication. So why did I write the intubation indication? The reason is, even if you are not managing to provide, you are not planning to provide a long-term care, you may have patients who are coming to you late and collapsing. You need to stabilize them. You may have a patient who was on HFNC or NIV and you need to transport. You cannot transport on an HFNC. HFNC does not have a battery backup. NIVs have battery backup, but it will be difficult to transport a patient on NIV also. So if you need to transport a critically ill patient, you may need to intubate him. So we need to know what are the indications for intubation wherever we are providing the care, even if it's not a tertiary care center. So if the saturation remains less than 90%, in spite of non-invasive supports, you need to intubate. Even if your oxygenation is maintained, the child is on NIV, but you find that the respiratory distress is bad, there is high tidal volume, more than 9.5 ml per kg tidal volume on an NIV, that is an indication that you have to intubate. Then refractory shock and a GCS less than 8 are independent indications for intubation. So when you indicate, whenever you're planning an intubation, you have to remember the mnemonic, that is SOAP-ME. You're looking for suction, oxygen, airway equipments, pharmacy, and monitoring equipment. So these things, I always say SOAP-ME and see that these things are there so that you're not missing out anything, especially in COVID. You don't want to run around there, go in and out. wherever you're intubating, if you have a negative pressure room or if you have a room with an exhaust, it is better to intubate the patient in that room. You can then move him to the general room so that the spread does not happen much. And at the place of intubation, preferably only 3 people should be there. That is the staff nurse, the person who is intubating, and the person who is assisting. Suction needs to be connected, but do suction only if it's needed, because suction is aerosol generating. Then oxygenate in a way that the patient is self-breathing. That means rather than going for a bag and mask and being hyper enthusiastic, you can put a non-rebreathing mask and oxygenate the patient, or you can put a vein circuit and oxygen, that is anesthetic bag and oxygen. As far as possible, allow the patient to breathe off its own and get a pre-oxygenation, because your pushing in air again has an aerosolization problem. Then as far as possible, cuff DT tube should be put. Now tubes are available from size 3, but in the government setup, usually you are getting only size 5 above. And if it's a bigger child, you can put an HME filter. Smaller children, HME filter should not be put because it increases the dead space. So before intubating itself, you're taking the ventilator, you're connecting the ventilator tubings, you're connecting the closed suction to the ventilator. You're taking your ET tube and seeing that the size of the ET tube is appropriate for the baby. If the cuff DT tube is available, you want to take a cuff DT tube. Then you want a aerosol box. And regarding video laryngoscope, it is good to have, but don't feel that it is mandatory, because in fact, we have found that the routine laryngoscope is easier to intubate than video laryngoscope, because once you have the video laryngoscope, the problem is you're going to see the larynx very well. You're going to see your vocal cords, and you're so hyper excited that you're able to see the vocal cords so well. But you will find that as you put your tube, it does not go into that direction. So because you're keeping an arrow, the idea of using a video laryngoscope is to remain away from the patient. You don't want to go so near the patient. But if you're putting an aerosol box, you will realize that you will anyway be away from the patient. So I would say that now during this time, anyone you are intubating, be it a COVID negative patient, whatever it is, do all these. When you do all these procedures, only you realize that there are so many places at which you are going to fumble. So practice. Only then in the right time, you will be able to do it appropriately without much fumbling and much problem. The patient suddenly stops breathing. You have to give an ambu. How do you, from where will the ambu enter? So it's always better to have a mock drill beforehand to see that how you can do this. Only then when the patient comes, you will be able to do it smoothly. So that is important to do that also. Then have your medications ready. One thing important here is that along with the sedation and the analgesic that you give pre-intubation, it is important that you paralyze the patient. Why do you want to paralyze? You don't want the baby to cough when you are intubating. So it is important that you also paralyze and then you intubate. And you may have your stent around, but it's a fancy accessory in COVID. I call that because you are not going to hear anything through your ears covered by the PPE. What are you going to hear? You're not going to hear the lung sounds. So all you're going to see is clinically if the chest is rising, if it looks equal, and good to have an ETCO2 with a multi-channel monitor, which will tell you exactly if your this thing has gone inside or not. So if you have the facility or having at least one monitor with ETCO2 would be really helpful. So having said that, so what are the other precautions that we said now? One is when you're using the bag and mask, have an HME filter there. So this allows that the exhaled air is not directly coming. You should have remembered that whenever you're doing a bag and mask, you're allowing the air to go inside. But what is the air that is coming out from the patient? It is coming to the environment. So to prevent that contamination, you can have an HME filter there. You can clamp your ET tube before you are introducing so that even if the patient coughs, the secretions are not coming onto your face. Then you can connect a closed suction tube beforehand itself so that once you have intubated and connected the patient to the tubings, if you need a suction, you can use the closed suction. You don't have to disconnect the baby. And if you have a video laryngoscope, you can use it, but that is not mandatory. And this we already said, it's good to have aerosol boxes also. This serves multiple purpose. It helps you in intubating. At the same time, when the patient is on an NIV, the patient also on HFNC, you can just keep it there so that you're able to visualize. At the same time, you are decreasing the contamination to the environment. So having said that, regarding steroids, the earlier papers all said that steroids should not be used, but now we know that we have guidelines of steroid. In fact, even that time, when the WHO was not favoring steroids, when the ITSA guideline said that use it only if the patient has a refractory shock and ARDS. But even that time, the earlier papers that were coming from China did show that low dose of steroids was helpful in patients who were hypoxic and having respiratory symptoms. And now we have the recovery trial. Here again, what did you learn? You learned that only on patients who are on oxygen or on invasive mechanical ventilation, the steroid is helpful, not for patients who are not on oxygen therapy. So never think of starting a methylpred or a Dexona in the patient in the category A or a category B. It's only the category C patient with oxygen dependence that you are planning to give the steroids. It's a low dose steroid which you're planning to give for 7 to 10 days. The reason is because we all know initially it is the host viral response. That is when you're presenting with a high fever, with sore throat, diarrhea, vomiting. That time your aim is to start an antiviral as early as possible. As the disease gets localized to the lung and the hypoxia sets in, you know that the virus is still there, but there is also an inflammatory cascade happening. So you want a combination of antiviral with immune modulating things like a steroid. And as the patient worsens further with the second onset of fever, you know that you are having a hyperinflammatory storm or the category, this thing where more than the antiviral, you are bothered about disease modifying agents, that is anti-inflammatory agents like tocilizumab. Now, this is very important. When whatever I said all this time, the chunk of the talk has been on the respiratory support in a pediatric patient. But you should know that the number of children who are going to require respiratory support is in fact going to be very less. But definitely what you are going to see more is this, that is multi-system inflammatory syndrome in children. So this is very, very important for us to understand what disease and why does this happen, because more children, when the COVID pandemic was at the onset, there were hardly any patients in the ICU. But as the disease progressed for 3 or 4 weeks, world over everywhere, they described multiple patients getting admitted to ICU with multi-organ dysfunction. So when do you suspect an MIS-C? Any patient in the coming weeks who comes with fever and you find that the inflammatory markers are high, especially the CRP is high, the ESR is high, you may not be doing a D-dimer and ferritin at admission, but even when you see a CRP high, especially more than 100 milligrams, or you find ferritin which is high, or D-dimer which is more than 1, you should think that the patient has gone for a hyperinflammatory response, and in the presence of an organ involvement, think of MIS. So anyone with unexplained fever, with high inflammatory markers, with whatever symptoms they present with, if they show evidence of an organ involvement, you should think of MIS. These patients, it is not mandatory that they will have an antigen positivity. They may have evidence of COVID infection. They may not have evidence of COVID infection. Some of them would give you history of having an influenza-like illness in the family in the preceding 4 weeks. So what are the clinical features? They may have clinical features typical to your Kawasaki disease, that is fever, conjunctival condition, your red lips, irritability, cracked lips, cervical lymphadenopathy, extremity edema, rash. These are the classical Kawasaki disease that you see in a child. That means fever with a rash. Just like measles-like presentation, you have a red baby and irritable child you think of. But along with that, what is important is that this group of MIS-C has significant GI symptoms. Almost 80% of patients. So the next time you find a child coming to you with fever with diarrhea and vomiting, as a baseline, send a CRP. Send an ESR just to see that if it is high, you're not expecting that in an infective viral diarrhea. So if that is high, you're probably dealing with an MIS-C. And an important clinical feature is an abdominal pain. There have been several case reports where the patient has come as an acute abdomen, severe abdominal pain, vomiting, patient has been taken up for surgery. They open up and they don't find an appendicitis there. The clinical diagnosis was appendicitis, and finally it turns out to be an MIS-C. So GI symptoms, when they manifest, we have to definitely think about multi-system inflammatory syndrome in which the children presented. Most of the children present in cardiogenic shock because the initial symptoms we miss out. They come with fever, they come with diarrhea, vomiting. We are not looking for the inflammatory markers. We are not thinking about an MIS-C. Then after 3 or 4 days, they come with exertional dyspnea or they come with frank decompensated shock. That is the time you are going to pick up. So this is the atypicality. Kawasaki disease children usually don't come with shock. You do see cardiogenic shock in Kawasaki disease, but that's a very small percentage. Whereas in MIS-C, that's a very big percentage if you're not presenting early. So the early case studies all were showing this cardiogenic shock as presentation of patients getting admitted to ICU with cardiogenic shock. Then people learn that children are presenting not during the acute phase of COVID, but rather presenting during the convalescent phase or 2 to 3 weeks after a COVID with an MIS-C. So what they did now, So now the dictum is anyone coming with an unexplained fever, you look for inflammatory markers so that you're picking up this MIS-C cases early. When you're picking up the cases early and starting your treatment early, they are not progressing to cardiogenic shock. So that is very important. We need to be very alert about this manifestation, because if you pick them up early, they are not going to come to you with a shock. So that is important. So difference is that it is Kawasaki you usually think of in children less than 5 years. Here you should think about in any patient less than 21 years. The median age is in fact 10 years. So you're going to see the child. So the child with a MIS-C currently under our treatment is 12-year-old. The child had initially come with a headache and later went on to have a headache and did not have a fever. So we were always thinking of MIS-C, but without fever, we thought, no, it wouldn't be. But the second day he develops vomiting and diarrhea. You check the inflammatory markers, they are all high. So that is important that when you get the GI symptoms as the initial symptom, 80%. So the moment you see that, think about MIS-C. And earlier, only 80% cardiogenic shock. Now, if you diagnose early, you're going to have less number of patients with cardiogenic shock. And usually the time to diagnosis from the initial symptom, the earliest studies have shown 6 days. So our aim is to pick up patients early, treat them early, so that this delay is prevented, this morbidity and mortality is prevented. But fortunately, you should understand that coronary dilatation is seen in only 17% of cases. Mainly, it is the myocardial edema. It is not ischemia. So if you are sending for a screening TROP-T and TROP-I, it may not be moderately elevated. Our patient had a very high TROP-I, but it's not necessary that it is very high. Most of them have only mild to moderate elevation. What is important is they come with cardiogenic shock. It may be due to LV dysfunction, which is the commonest. There may be RV dysfunction. There may be regional wall hypokinesis also. So any child with suspected MIS-C, it is mandatory that we look for the markers. What is preferred is the NT-proBNP, which is supposed to be elevated. But if not, but at least echo is mandatory. So investigations, we said when the CRP is more than 100, you think about it. When the D-dimer they found was around 5,000 nanograms. So anybody more than 1,000, you should be thinking about it. And NT-proBNP also, the studies have shown to be around 5,000. So these are the important investigations that we should be looking for. Definitely interleukin, we don't plan to look, but definitely we plan to look CRP. And if the facility is available, I would say definitely send for NT-proBNP also. And how do you diagnose? You realize that the antibody is positive in 86%. So even if your antigen is negative, don't think it is not COVID-related MIS-C. Antigen is positive only in 34%. So the majority is going to have a antibody positivity if you're really looking into it. Outcome, thankfully, if you pick up the disease at time and you're giving the treatment, the median hospital stay is 7 to 10 days. The patient show a very good response to IVIG. And 70% of the patient have a normal ejection fraction at discharge. So that is also good. And no thrombotic or embolic events have been reported in these children. So if they don't respond to IVIG, you'll end up giving methylpred. Sometimes when you have bigger children and you have cost issues, you may think of using a methylpred first and then IVIG as a secondary drug also. And both ways, now many of the studies from India are showing MIS-C a good response to steroid. So that may be an individual basis, which do you want to use. Then the take-home messages are don the appropriate PPE while taking care of patients. So be safe yourself and be safe for the patient also. Remember, the etiology of COVID-19 is varied. Depending on the having that pathophysiology in the back of your mind helps you to decide how to treat them. Then always watch out for cytokine release syndrome. When we say cytokine release syndrome, we are really thinking about the adult who is worsening. In a child, you may be thinking of hypercytokine response mainly in the days following a COVID acute infection. So in the times of COVID, anyone with an unexplained fever should be thought of the possibility of having an MIS. Thank you very much.
I was going through the chat. Many of them have commented about the presentation, it is excellent presentation like that. But 1 or 2 questions I have received, that is, what are the clinical features specific for newborns? What are the drugs that may be useful in newborn? I think that you have covered in the session. So that might be a question that was early for might be presentation, when we share the presentation, that will be answer. Then one is role of chloroquine in and role of remdesivir, that was seen somewhere. Madam, can you just start that role of that?
What do you want me to ask? Role of chloroquine in the new, if you are looking at a specific treatment for newborn, definitely I already said, in newborn, no antivirals, no disease modifying agents. It is just your routine care. Means you are having a TTN, you are having a tachypnea, you will give the respiratory support that you normally give, normal antibiotic coverage, nothing specific to COVID. The treatment exactly in a symptomatic newborn is just like any other disease the baby is going to have. So nothing, addition, you don't have anything there. Then what was the other question you asked?
Role of CRP, how routinely will you do CRP in OP? That was one question.
OP patient, category A patient, we really don't plan to send any investigations at all. You are going to give them only symptomatic management without any investigation. If the patient has fever and is admitted and is COVID positive, you will definitely, along with the blood routine, you will send a CRP. That is mandatory.
And remdesivir.
Baseline investigation that you want to do.
Next is remdesivir in newborn, azithromycin in newborn. These are some questions.
That's why I said we are not planning to give drugs to newborn in the sense of COVID infection. We will rather manage the newborn cases as just ordinary cases. No specific drugs there.
Any specific features for newborn getting COVID? That was one question.
That I already said that COVID, usually COVID is asymptomatic in a newborn. So even though there have been symptoms reported, just like in older children, like respiratory distress, tachypnea, retractions, diarrhea, vomiting has been reported. But we do not know exactly whether it is because of the viral replication or it is the routine clinical feature of the routine complications that a newborn preterm or a term baby happens. And this is just a bystander there. So we are planning, and what the recommendation is, just provide them with the routine care that you normally provide. We are not advising anything more. Only the preventive aspect is there for the newborn.
Is there any less sized stick for newborns to take nasopharyngeal swab? That was one question.
So it is the same swab. It is the same swab that we are taking for the older ones. But as you all know, when you put a nasopharyngeal swab in a newborn, it may not be easy to reach the pharynx. So wherever you reach, you take. The idea is to reach the nasopharynx, but if it's not possible to reach there, you take a nasal swab. That's it.
Anybody can ask, anybody who is having doubts can ask now. Please unmute yourself.
No, I think they have given some questions. I will try adding that. In a routine pediatric OPD, what all PPE to be used in the COVID season? Right now, what we are doing is we are all using an N95 mask and a visor while we are in the OPD. And we have all stitched our own gowns so that you have some feel of protection. But we have to remember that contact spread is not that much. It is the droplet spread that we are bothered about. So I would say N95 mask and visor is important. Then most common symptom, fever, cough or fatigue. The initial symptom is usually a sore throat and anosmia and agnosia. Then you go on, it is the severity. When you have a fatigue, you don't take those patients lightly. If you have fatigue, that means you are having a significant infection. There is a chance of you going in for complication. You need to be careful. If a patient has fever and when the fever comes down, the patient is feeling happy, it is probably a small viremia. Most of them, the fever is subsiding by 48 hours and then later they develop other symptoms. So that we need to be careful about. Then should we do RT-PCR for all diarrhea cases? No. Unless they are coming from a containment zone, you don't do RT-PCR for all diarrhea patients. You are only doing an antigen test. You're doing RT-PCR only when your suspicion is very high or the patient lands up in ICU, you do a RT-PCR. Otherwise, you're doing only an antigen test. Up to what age newborn, no medicines for COVID. The presently, whatever I presented, in fact, it is not even HCQ and also we usually would prefer to give it beyond infancy. Remdesivir, antiviral drug, which is relatively safer but still has got hepatic problems. So that would be for using an infant, it should be the institutional board that should be taking a decision. Beyond infancy, definitely remdesivir is recommended. Even in infancy, it can be given if you feel that the symptoms are significant, because antiviral is important when the respiratory symptoms are setting in. Using an antiviral late in the disease will not be of much use. Using it early would be more beneficial.
The rational time testing COVID in newborn after 24 hours is one question.
And I think I had answered that, because before 24 hours, if you're taking the maternal amniotic fluids, contamination may be there and you may be getting false positive. You may be also getting a false negative because the patient is going to develop a symptom later. So you taking a swab early may not pick up the disease. Even though now...
Madam, continue, ma'am.
And I also highlighted that I'm not really for that second swab. Second swab can be taken if the mother's second swab is going. You can take the baby's second swab. The first swab is mandatory and that should be after 24 hours.
Is it necessary to do inflammatory markers in children coming with diarrhea is one question.
If the patient has fever, definitely. Fever. I'm more bothered about the fever. Definitely, if a fever with diarrhea, inflammatory markers doesn't mean that we are going to send a D-dimer, ferritin for every baby that is coming, but definitely send CRP. If you're having, you are expecting a viral diarrhea, you're not expecting the CRP even positive. And even when the CRP is positive, a mild to moderate positivity, you're not really bothered. You're really bothered if it is high. If it is more than 100, you're bothered definitely that this is bad. This is a simple diarrhea patient should not be coming to you with 100 CRP, because you need to give treatment for that patient. So that becomes important for us to pick up.
The risk of secondary bacterial infection in cases so far, from your experience, that might
secondary bacterial infection risk, we are not seeing much. It's only if you're landing up giving disease modifying, especially when you go for your interleukin-6 suppressants, tocilizumab, the chance of it, but we haven't used in pediatric till now. Then is it necessary to wait for RT-PCR result for discharge? Your antigen is negative, you send it. We don't send RT-PCR for patients fit for discharge. We just do an antigen. If it's negative, we send them. Our aim should be to get these patients as early as possible from the hospital out to their home if they are safe. Because we should know that by day 10 or 14, the chance of infectivity is very, very less. RT-PCR will remain positive as some amount of viral particles will be there.
And the role of tocilizumab in pediatrics?
Role of tocilizumab is only in case of a severe category C patient with evidence of hyperinflammatory syndrome and organ involvement. And organ involvement means we say that CRS 3 or 4. Adult in the guideline, the same thing we are following for children. Again, I repeat that more than the cytokine release syndrome, what you're going to see is the multi-system inflammatory syndrome in children, which responds good to steroids as well as IV.
If an antenatal woman tested 7 to 10 days prior to delivery was positive and post-delivery becomes negative, but if the child is positive, when do we repeat the test in that newborn?
It remains the same. If the child is asymptomatic, you need to repeat it on the day 10. If the child is symptomatic, maybe day 14. So if the child is positive, you have to repeat it. If the child is negative, you are happy. What about SAM babies? Are there a less chance of cytokine storm? Unfortunately, I wouldn't say so, because we've already had a Kwashiorkor death with a cytokine storm features. So shouldn't be really thinking that SAM children. Usually we always have a tendency to think that if your immune system is weak, maybe you won't have a cytokine storm. It's not necessarily so. Encephalitis-like presentation in COVID, patients who are coming with MISC do have some amount of neurological symptoms, but we have not come across frank, complete, isolated encephalitis. And I think we are in the beginning of an outcome. As more diseases, more patients present in pediatric age group, we may be able to see that.
Regarding MISC, should we suspect only when they have atypical GI symptoms along with features similar to Kawasaki?
No, that's what I would like to highlight again and again. Any patient with an unexplained fever, think of MISC. Any patient with any symptom, because we said, no, they can come with diarrhea, vomiting, cough, rash, anything. They needn't have all these symptoms. So anyone coming with an unexplained symptom, just send for a CRP and then look. Remember that you're going to diagnose MISC at least if 2 organs are involved. If two organ function is not involved, it is an isolated fever without any organ involvement, you are not going to diagnose MIs. But every disease has a spectrum. Initially, ഏതെങ്കിലും രീതി തുടങ്ങണ്ടേ, അത് കഴിഞ്ഞിട്ടല്ലേ ഓരോ ഓർഗൻ വരാൻ പോകുന്നത്. അപ്പൊ അൺഎക്സ്പ്ലെയിൻഡ് ഫീവർ ആയിട്ട് വരുന്ന പേഷ്യൻസിനെല്ലാം ഒരു CRP നമുക്ക് നോക്കാം, no harm. And the suspicion is high and you have a facility to look for an NT-proBNP, I would say look. Otherwise, CRP definitely I would recommend.
Can we use HF hypronasal cannula for
with the double bubble CPAP machine? Yes, it can be used. There's a little adaptation that is needed for that, but that can be used. And regarding bubble CPAP, you should know that I have not mentioned about bubble CPAP. In fact, it will come only after HFNC, because bubble CPAP is considered as more aerosol generating than HFNC. Because in HFNC, the flow is happening not under pressure. In a bubble CPAP, the flow is happening under pressure. So that also we need to remember. So if COVID in the problem, when we are thinking of treatment, double thoughts. You want to protect the other patients in your ICU, you want to protect yourself, and you want to give a good treatment to the baby also. So both these parameters have equal importance. Always remember, if one of us, if one of the health workers get infected, and as we move out from the scene of management, the next replacement may not be as we desire. Maybe as if the outbreak becomes bad, the clinician may get replaced by a non-clinician to manage. So always try to protect yourself. You are needed more for the patients as well as for yourself. So every treatment, we need to think about that.
One is
I think one question is, remdesivir less than 12 years as no DGCA approval. Yes, we have written in the guidelines that it can be given for children less than 10 years, less than 12 years. The reason is it has an FDA approval. It is an emergency use authorization from the FDA for use in children. So definitely we will be going ahead with remdesivir, this thing getting a written consent. There is no way that we will not be using remdesivir for children.
And the role of zinc, vitamin C, etc. in positive and prophylaxis.
Anyway, they don't harm. So definitely for diarrhea, definitely we will be starting zinc for anyone who's coming in the category A, especially with the GI symptoms. Then vitamin C, vitamin D can be given. It doesn't harm. There are certain patients, certain papers telling it's the use. Since we know that the routine doses are not going to harm, we'll be definitely recommending. Total confirmed cases in pediatric age groups and in newborns in Kerala, I will not be able to tell you the exact numbers. In our hospital, I think our numbers are close to 100 now. But definitely, thankfully, very, very mild cases. So it's the numbers that is more scary than the patients as such.
And the experience in plasma infusion is one question.
No, pediatric cases, as we should know that we have not used tocilizumab in pediatric. We have had one case of tocilizumab being used in the for a patient in the onset of our disease in Calicut. That was a small baby, and that had come very bad to them, very bad to them. In fact, the baby was received in cardiac arrest. So that was the only case, I think, for a pediatric patient I know of being given tocilizumab. Otherwise, we haven't given tocilizumab.
Can we admit patients suspected with MISC in general, I think along with the general?
It depends upon, right now we are not doing the antibody test. So even though there are certain private labs which are offering the antibody test, we are looking only at the antigen. So if the antigen is positive, the patient doesn't come to the general ward. The patient remains. For our patients, initially when they came and when they were antigen positive, they were in the COVID isolation, COVID ICU only. But once the antigen became negative, we shifted them to our general ICU. So we do that, because especially if 10 days has passed, then there is no point in. And we should know that we are going to get infected not from the confirmed cases. We are going to get infected from the non-confirmed cases.
For logistic reason, we find difficult to initiate breastfeeding postnatal and room in postnatal anywhere following this policy.
For logistic issues?
For logistic reasons, they find it difficult to initiate breastfeeding, and I just missed that.
But I think initiating breastfeeding should not have a logistic issue, because you are telling the mother the benefit of the breastfeeding and you're encouraging them to breastfeed. We are definitely not giving formula. We are definitely not asking them to give an EBM also. That was in the initial stage of the outbreak where we thought about those things. Now we are allowing the rooming in and we are allowing breastfeeding, definitely. So that should not be a problem. I think we need to convince ourselves and we need to convince, because patient, as I said, newborn വളരെ mild symptoms ആണ്. Usually symptoms ഇല്ല. പിന്നെ എന്തിനു നമുക്ക് ആ ബ്രസ്റ്റ് മിൽക്കിന്റെ അത്രയും ഇമ്പോർട്ടന്റ് ആയിട്ടുള്ള, we are seeing more number of patients coming with kwashiorkor during the lockdown. That is because the mother does not have milk for some reason and you have gone on for a faulty feeding. So please, please, please encourage breastfeeding. How often do we take an azithromycin? We usually take initially itself, we take. Otherwise, we are not going on repeating. Short course, we are giving only for 5 days. When you are having a rheumatoid arthritis disease modifying, you are giving for years and months. So we just take one ECG. If it is okay, we don't repeat it.
Should we delay routine immunization, and how long should we delay in a COVID recovered baby?
Now, that is a little tricky question, because if the patient was just in your hospital for some reason and the patient was asymptomatic, you can give the routine vaccination at discharge. And cherry or catch under, because someone asked me once, recovered patient and nammal vaccine koduthu vidette. Appo normally nammal vaccine ella disease na nammal parayunnathu, when the patient has recovered, don't miss the opportunity, give the vaccine and send. Can be followed in COVID also, but you have to remember that the problem with the pediatric population is the persons who is going to get sick is the MISC one. Appa MISC one eppa venelum after an acute COVID infection manifest cheyyam. Appa namukku high risk patient aanu, avan thirichu vaccination edukkan veruvo illo ennu namukku veliya orappillengil definitely give vaccination. Vaccination doesn't harm. You want to protect the baby. If a patient is known to you and you are sure of the patient coming back for vaccination, I would say ask them to come after 1 month. Otherwise, give it during the discharge itself.
ഷീജ മാഡം, ഈ ന്യൂ ബോണിന്റെ ഡിസ്ചാർജ് ക്രൈറ്റീരിയ അഡൽട്ട് ഡിസ്ചാർജ് ക്രൈറ്റീരിയ സെയിം ആണോ മാഡം? അങ്ങനെ തന്നെയാണോ മാഡം?
സെയിം തന്നെ. ഉദ്ദേശിച്ചത് ന്യൂ ബോൺ പോസിറ്റീവ് ആണെങ്കിൽ എന്ത് ചെയ്യണമെന്നുള്ളതല്ലേ ഉദ്ദേശിച്ചത്?
പോസിറ്റീവ് ആണെങ്കിൽ എപ്പോൾ ഡിസ്ചാർജ് ചെയ്യാൻ?
ന്യൂ ബോൺ പോസിറ്റീവ് ആണെങ്കിൽ അഡൽട്ട് ഡിസ്ചാർജ് ക്രൈറ്റീരിയ തന്നെയാണ് ഫോളോ ചെയ്യുന്നത്. ശരിക്കും പറഞ്ഞാൽ നമ്മൾ അങ്ങനെ ഫോളോ ചെയ്യുന്നതാണ്. ഇൻഫാക്ട് CDC doesn't recommend so. CDC says that after 24 hours, you take one sample. After 48 hours, you repeat a sample. If the patient is going home before 48 hours, you don't repeat sample. And even if the result initially comes positive, you just follow them up, follow them telephonically. That's CDC guideline. The CDC is not really bothered about a newborn getting infected with COVID if the baby is asymptomatic and feeding well. But right now, in Kerala as well as India, we seem to be following up anyone who is positive, and we want to leave them free only after 10 days. So, നമ്മുടെ നാഷണൽ ഗൈഡ് ലൈൻസ്, ഇപ്പോഴത്തെ പ്രസന്റ് ഗൈഡ് ലൈൻസ് നമ്മൾ അഡൽട്ടിന്റെ അതേ പ്രോട്ടോകോൾ തന്നെ ന്യൂ ബോണിന് ഫോളോ ചെയ്യും. അതാ ഞാൻ പിന്നെയും പറഞ്ഞ, രണ്ടാമത്തെ സാമ്പിൾ എടുക്കാൻ പറ്റില്ല എന്ന് വെച്ച് വെപ്രാളപ്പെടേണ്ട. നത്തിങ് വിൽ ഹാപ്പൻ.
ഓക്കേ മാഡം, താങ്ക് യു.
Divya, any role for prophylactic anticoagulation? Yes, I said we will start prophylactic anticoagulation for any children who are presenting with hypoxic respiratory involvement. So definitely Faxiparen will be started, especially if the D dimer is high. Then is it justified in taking a decision if antigen is negative when the baby can still be positive? I think I answered that. If antigen is negative, you are justified in taking the decision, because every baby you are now discharging from the hospital, you are looking only at the antigen. You're not really bothered about the RT-PCR. I think the onus is on the symptoms. That should be the thing. You should really educate them about the symptoms and the importance of coming back to you in case any symptoms develop. That is more important.
IVIG given patient and immunization.
IVIG and immunization, we need to know that here, if you're MISC, if you're giving IVIG, you're going to give 2 grams per kg. So that is a contraindication or a precaution for not giving a live injectable vaccine. Adinu maathre namukku oru precaution ullu. Appo IVIG edutha oralku DPT booster aanu adutha pending il kodukka. If IVIG kodutha kunyinu MRO MMRO aanu adutha kittandeyengil, you have to wait for 11 months. So live injectable vaccine after an IVIG, you have to wait for 11 months. All other vaccines can be routinely administered.
മാഡം, ഇമ്മ്യൂണൈസേഷൻ ഒരു ഡൗട്ട് കൂടി മാഡം.
എന്തോ
മാഡം, ഇമ്മ്യൂണൈസേഷൻ അസിംപ്റ്റമാറ്റിക് ന്യൂ ബോൺസ് ആണെന്നുണ്ടെങ്കിൽ ഡിസ്ചാർജിന് മുമ്പ് നമ്മുടെ
immunization, all newborns when you are discharging, you will immunize and send. Absolutely no doubt.
മാഡം കാറ്റഗറി എ ബി സിക്ക് എന്തെങ്കിലും വ്യത്യാസമുണ്ടോ മാഡം?
അല്ല, നമ്മൾ ന്യൂ ബോണിനെ കുറിച്ച് പറയുകയാണെങ്കിൽ അവരുടെ റുട്ടീൻ ഇമ്മ്യൂണൈസേഷൻ ഇസ് ഓഫ് ഹൈ ഇമ്പോർട്ടൻസ്. സോ പ്ലീസ് ഡോണ്ട് ഡിലേ ദ റുട്ടീൻ ഇമ്മ്യൂണൈസേഷൻ because we know that this baby is going to get have a protective antibody level only after it completes the primary immunization. So newborns at discharge, naturally they are asymptomatic and they are well. You are going to give the vaccine and send it. We are not expecting an MISC in a newborn.
ഓക്കെ മാഡം. അപ്പൊ പിന്നെ 6 വീക്സ് ഇമ്മ്യൂണൈസേഷൻ 4 വീക്സ് ഗ്യാപ്പ് വേണം അങ്ങനെയൊന്നുമില്ലല്ലോ? റൊട്ടീൻ ആയിട്ട് ഇമ്മ്യൂണൈസേഷൻ കണ്ടിന്യൂ ചെയ്ത് പോവാം, കോവിഡ് ആയിട്ട് റിലേഷൻ ഒന്നുമില്ല?
എപ്പോഴും നമ്മൾ ഒരേ വാക്സിന്റെ 2 ഡോസ് കൊടുക്കണമെങ്കിൽ 4 ആഴ്ച ഗ്യാപ്പ് വേണം.
4 വീക്സ് ഗ്യാപ്പ് വേണം.
4 വീക്സ് ഗ്യാപ്പ് വേണം. അപ്പം ഈ കുഞ്ഞിന് ഇപ്പം ഒരു സിവിയർ ഡിസീസ് ഉണ്ടായിരുന്നു, നമ്മൾ ഡിസ്ചാർജ് ചെയ്തപ്പോൾ തന്നെ ഡേ 20 ഡിസ്ചാർജ് ചെയ്തിട്ടുള്ളെങ്കിൽ അന്ന് നമ്മളുള്ള വാക്സിൻസ് എല്ലാം കൊടുത്തിട്ട് 1 മാസം കഴിഞ്ഞ് വന്ന് അടുത്ത ഡോസ് എടുക്കാൻ പറയും. അത്രയേ ഉള്ളൂ.
ഓക്കെ മാഡം, താങ്ക് യു. ശരി, താങ്ക്സ്.
പാർട്ടിസിപ്പൻസ് എല്ലാം ഫീഡ്ബാക്ക് ഫോമിന്റെ ലിങ്ക് ചാറ്റിലുണ്ട്, ഒന്നത് ഫില്ല് ചെയ്യണം. ഓരോ ക്വസ്റ്റ്യൻസ് ആൻസർ ചെയ്യുന്നതിന്റെ ഇടയ്ക്ക് ആ ഒരു കാര്യം കൂടെ നടത്തിയാൽ നമ്മൾക്ക് ഇംപ്രൂവ് ചെയ്യാനുള്ള ഒരു ചാൻസ് അതാണ്. അപ്പൊ അതും കൂടെ ഒന്ന് ചെയ്താൽ.
Is methylpred and IVIG only treatment options in MISC? As I said, IVIG is the preferred one, but there are situations where you're using methylpred first and then if needed IVIG. Unfortunately, patients are responding to methylpred. ഇത് രണ്ടിലും റെസ്പോണ്ട് ചെയ്യാത്ത ഒരു ചെറിയ സബ്സെറ്റ് ഓഫ് പേഷ്യൻസ് വരും. maximum, most of the patients will respond to these drugs. Almost 99% of them will respond. Only 1% may not respond. There you may have to go for further immunosuppression. That's a very small population.
Prophylactic anticoagulant in the choice.
Prophylactic anticoagulant, we are usually using low molecular weight heparin, that is praxiparin, 1 milligram per kilogram subcutaneous as a once daily dose, provided the child does not have any other risk factors. And risk factors, there are any bleeding tendency or the routine healthy children, definitely it can be offered. Again, remember, it is only for the category C patients, which you are going to see in very small numbers.
മാഡം, ഹൈഡ്രോക്സിക്ലോറോക്വിൻ ന്യൂബോൺസിന് കൊടുക്കാൻ പറ്റില്ല എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞു. കട്ട് ഓഫ് ഉണ്ടോ മാഡം? ഇൻഫന്റിന് കൊടുക്കാൻ പറ്റുമോ?
അല്ല, ഹൈഡ്രോക്സിക്ലോറോക്വിൻ ശരിക്കും നമ്മൾ ഇൻഫന്റ്സിനും നമ്മൾ റെക്കമെൻഡ് ചെയ്യുന്നില്ല. മെഡിക്കൽ ബോർഡ് ആവശ്യപ്പെടുന്നുണ്ടെങ്കിൽ തീർച്ചയായിട്ടും കൊടുക്കാം. റുട്ടീൻ ആയിട്ട് നമ്മൾ ഗൈഡ് ലൈൻസ് നോക്കിക്കഴിഞ്ഞാൽ HCQ recommendation is not there for infants. There are no specific recommendations. അതാണ് കൊടുക്കണ്ടെന്നും ആരും പറയുന്നില്ല. ഇൻ ജനറൽ നമ്മൾ സാധാരണ ഒരു HCQ എടുത്ത് നോക്കിയാൽ ക്യാൻ ഇറ്റ് ബി യൂസ്ഡ് ഇൻ ഇൻഫന്റ് എന്ന് ചോദിച്ചാൽ ഇറ്റ് ഇസ് നോട്ട് ടു ബി യൂസ്ഡ്. ആ ഒരു ഇത് വെച്ചിട്ടാണ് പറഞ്ഞത് ഇൻഫന്റ്സ് വി ആർ നോട്ട് പ്ലാനിങ് ടു യൂസ് an HCQ. But so those kind of decisions, that is gray zones, decision has to be taken by the medical board and not by individual decisions.
Okay madam, thank you.
മാഡം, ന്യൂ ബോണിനെ മദറിന്റെ കൂടെ കൊടുക്കുന്നുണ്ടെങ്കിൽ ആരാ ന്യൂ ബോണിനെ ടേക്ക് കെയർ ചെയ്യുന്നത്?
മദറിന്റെ കൂടെ കൊടുത്താലും we are always allowing one bystander. Preferably the bystander should be less than 60 years of age, and the patient bystander should also be screened, and they should also be offered mask as well as hand hygiene.
അല്ല, മദർ പോസിറ്റീവ് ആണ്, നെഗറ്റീവ് ബൈസ്റ്റാൻഡർ നിർത്താൻ പറ്റുമോ കൂടെ?
മദർ പോസിറ്റീവ് ആണെങ്കിലും നമുക്ക് ബൈസ്റ്റാൻഡർ ഇല്ലാതെ ഇറ്റ് ഇസ് നോട്ട് പോസിബിൾ. നമുക്ക് സ്റ്റാഫ് അത്രയൊന്നും ഇല്ല ടു മാനേജ് ചെയ്യാൻ. സോ വാട്ട് വി ഡു ഇസ് വി ഗെറ്റ് എ റിട്ടൺ കൺസെന്റ്. ഇൻഫാക്ട് നമ്മുടെ ഹോസ്പിറ്റലിൽ എല്ലാ പേഷ്യൻസും, നോട്ട് ഞാൻ ആന്റിനേറ്റൽ പോസ്റ്റ്നേറ്റൽ അല്ല പറയുന്നത്, എനി പേഷ്യന്റ്, എനി പീഡിയാട്രിക് പേഷ്യന്റ് ഗെറ്റ്സ് അഡ്മിറ്റഡ് ടു ദ ഹോസ്പിറ്റൽ, ദേ സൈൻ ദ കൺസെന്റ് ഫോം telling that this is a COVID hospital. I know that my child can get a COVID infection from here. അത് അറിഞ്ഞുകൊണ്ട് ഇവിടെ കിടക്കുന്നു എന്നുള്ളൊരു സമ്മതപത്രം വാങ്ങിച്ചിട്ടാണ് നമ്മൾ അഡ്മിറ്റ് ചെയ്യുന്നത്. അതുപോലെ തന്നെ മദർ പോസിറ്റീവ് ആണ്, ബൈസ്റ്റാൻഡർ നെഗറ്റീവ് ആണെങ്കിൽ അവരുടെ കയ്യിൽ നിന്ന് കൺസെന്റ് ഫോം വാങ്ങിച്ചിട്ടാണ് അവരെ ബൈസ്റ്റാൻഡർ ആയിട്ട് നിർത്തുന്നത്. After informed consent that they can get the disease. We don't have any other options. I think whatever other people say, we have to be practical. How do you manage otherwise?
Okay. Thank you.
ഷീജ മാഡം, ഞാൻ ഒരു കാര്യം, നമ്മൾ ഇപ്പോഴത്തെ ഒരു സിറ്റുവേഷനിൽ നമുക്കിപ്പോൾ ഒരുപാട് ഈ മദർ പോസിറ്റീവ് ചിൽഡ്രൻസ് ഒരുപാട് പോസിറ്റീവായിട്ട് വരുന്നുണ്ട്. അപ്പൊ ഈ ഒരുപാട് കുട്ടികൾ ബിലോ 1 year പോസിറ്റിവിറ്റി ആയിട്ട് മദറിന്റെ കുട്ടി വരുന്നതാണ്. ഞാൻ ഷീജ മാഡം കഴിഞ്ഞ് സംസാരിച്ചതാണ്. തിരിച്ചിടാവുന്നല്ല നമുക്കിപ്പോ അത് അതർവൈസ് ചൈൽഡ് സിംറ്റമാറ്റിക് ആണെങ്കിൽ below after newborn period whether mother and child can be in the CFLTC വിടാൻ പറ്റത്തില്ല, അങ്ങനെ തീരുമാനം എടുത്തോടെ. മിക്കവാറും കുട്ടികളെ
നമ്മൾ സെൻഡ് ബാക്ക് ചെയ്യുന്നുണ്ട്. സോറി കേട്ടോ, I forgot to message you back. ബിക്കോസ് സാറിനെ അന്ന് എനിക്ക് കിട്ടിയില്ല, എനിക്ക് നെക്സ്റ്റ് ഡേ കിട്ടിയുള്ളൂ. അപ്പൊ ഐ തോട്ട് ഹി മസ്റ്റ് ഹാവ് ടോൾഡ് യു ദാറ്റ് ഇസ് വാട്ട് ദ ഡിസിഷൻ ഇസ്. ദാറ്റ് ഇസ് ഇറ്റ് ഈസ് അവർ ഡിസിഷൻ എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞാൽ നമ്മുടെ ഹോസ്പിറ്റലിൽ വന്നു, നമ്മൾ കുഞ്ഞിനെ എക്സാമിൻ ചെയ്തു. കാരണം CFLTC എല്ലാ ഇൻഫൻസും വിത്ത് കോവിഡ് പോസിറ്റിവിറ്റി ഷുഡ് ബി റെഫേർഡ് ടു മെഡിക്കൽ കോളേജിന് തന്നെയാണ്. ബട്ട് വൺസ് യു ഹാവ് സീൻ ദ പേഷ്യന്റ്, യു ക്യാൻ റൈറ്റ് ദ ഡേഞ്ചർ സൈൻസ്, യു ക്യാൻ കൗൺസിൽ ദം ആൻഡ് യു ക്യാൻ സെൻഡ് ദം ബാക്ക് ടു CFLTC. You cannot send them back home, but you can send them back to CFLTC. No problem. സന്തോഷ് സർ അങ്ങനെ തന്നെയാണ് പറഞ്ഞത്.
ഇന്നിപ്പോ നമുക്ക് ഒരുപാട് ബേബീസ് വന്നിരിക്കുന്നത് ഇൻഫൻസിയിലെ. അപ്പൊ അതിന്റെ ഇഷ്യൂ അത് കാരണം നമുക്ക് അഡ്മിറ്റ് ചെയ്യുന്നതിന് ഒരുപാട് ലിമിറ്റേഷൻ, ബെഡ് ഒരുപാട് വരും. ഇപ്പൊ ജയറാം സാർ പറഞ്ഞ ഒരു ഇഷ്യൂ നമ്മൾ അവിടെ ഫേസ് ചെയ്യുന്നത്, അവിടെ ആൾറെഡി നമ്മുടെ വാർഡിലെല്ലാം ഓവർ ക്രൗഡഡ് ആണ്. ആൾറെഡി നമ്മുടെ 60 ബെഡുള്ള വാർഡിലെല്ലാം 62 ബെഡ് വെച്ച പേഷ്യൻസ് വെച്ച് കിടക്കുന്നത്. അപ്പൊ ഈ ബൈസ്റ്റാൻഡർ നിർത്തുമ്പോൾ ബൈസ്റ്റാൻഡർ ടേക്കിംഗ് കെയറിന്റെ പ്രശ്നങ്ങള്, അതുകൊണ്ട് ഈ ന്യൂബോണിന്റെ ഫീഡിങ്ങിന്റെ ഇഷ്യൂ നമ്മൾ നല്ല, അതാ ഞാനാ ചോദിച്ചത്, ലോജിസ്റ്റിക് ഇഷ്യൂ എന്ന് ഉദ്ദേശിച്ചത് ഇനിഷ്യേഷൻ ബ്രസ്റ്റ് ഫീഡിങ് അല്ല. കണ്ടിന്യൂ ചെയ്യാനായിട്ട് ഈ മിക്കവാറും ബേബീസ് മദർ ഒന്നെങ്കിൽ സിസേറിയൻ ആയിരിക്കും, അല്ലെങ്കിൽ എന്തെങ്കിലും കോംപ്ലിക്കേഷൻ ഉള്ളതായിരിക്കും അമ്മ ഒറ്റക്ക് ബ്രസ്റ്റ് ഫീഡ് ചെയ്യത്തില്ല. അമ്മയുടെ പിന്നെ പ്രശ്നം ചില കോമൺ ആയിട്ടുള്ള വാർഡാണ്, അതിൻ്റെ അകത്ത് ഈ ബേബിനെ കൊണ്ട് കിടക്കുന്ന ഇഷ്യൂസ് എല്ലാം കൂടി കൊണ്ടാണ് നമുക്കൊരു കണ്ടിന്യൂ ബ്രസ്റ്റ് ഫീഡിങ് ഇഷ്യൂ. നമ്മൾ വി ആർ ആൾസോ ഇൻ ഫേവർ ഓഫ് ബ്രസ്റ്റ് ഫീഡിങ്, ബട്ട് ലോജിസ്റ്റിക്കലി there is a limitation for that.
ശരിക്കും തോന്നുന്നു നമ്മൾ ഈ ആൾക്കാരെ നിൽക്കാൻ അനുവദിക്കുന്ന കാരണമായിരിക്കും നമുക്ക് ഇവിടെ അത്രയും പ്രോബ്ലം വരാത്തെ. ബൈസ്റ്റാൻഡറിന് നമ്മൾ വി ആർ നോട്ട് ബോധേർഡ് അല്ല, വി ആർ ഗിവിംഗ് ദാറ്റ് കൺസെന്റ് ഫോം ആൻഡ് മേക്കിംഗ് ദം സ്റ്റാൻഡ്, ബിക്കോസ് അതർവൈസ് നമുക്ക് ഫീഡിങ് എൻഷുർ ചെയ്യാനേ പറ്റത്തില്ല.
ഇപ്പൊ ജയറാം പറഞ്ഞ വിഷയം, നമ്മളിപ്പോ ബൈസ്റ്റാൻഡർ ഇപ്പൊ വേറെ പ്രശ്നം എന്ന് വെച്ചാൽ ഇപ്പൊ കോവിഡ് പോസിറ്റീവ് ആയാൽ ഈവൻ ഫാമിലിയിൽ ആര് പോലും അവർക്ക് ആക്സെപ്റ്റ്, ഈവൻ വിത്ത് മദർ പോലും ആക്സെപ്റ്റ് ചെയ്ത് മുന്നോട്ട് വന്ന ഒരു ആയിട്ടില്ല. കുറച്ച് കഴിയുമ്പോൾ മാറുമായിരിക്കും, പക്ഷെ ഇപ്പൊ സ്റ്റിൽ ലോട്ട് ഓഫ് ഡിഫിക്കൽട്ടി.
നമ്മൾ ഇതുവരെ ഒരു മദറിന് മാത്രമേ കയ്യിൽ കൊടുത്തിട്ടുള്ളൂ കുട്ടീനെ.
ആണോ? ഐ സി. എന്റെ സത്യം പറഞ്ഞാൽ വൺ ഓഫ് മൈ പേഷ്യൻസ് ഐ ന്യൂ പേഴ്സണലി, ദേ ഹാഡ് സിസേറിയൻ ലാസ്റ്റ് വീക്ക് അറ്റ് MCH. അവർ പ്രൈവറ്റ് ഹോസ്പിറ്റലിൽ പോയി, അവിടുന്ന് പോസിറ്റീവ് എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞ് ഇങ്ങോട്ട് വിട്ടു. They were roomed in with the baby അമ്മയെ ഒരുമിച്ച് തന്നെ കിടന്നു, ബ്രസ്റ്റ് ഫീഡ് ചെയ്തു, day 7 ഡിസ്ചാർജ് ആയി. I think we encourage that is easier.
We are asking options, but most of the mothers are denying. They are not ready to give.
അവരൊരു എസ്കേപ്പ് പോലെ നടത്തുന്ന, അവർക്ക് പിന്നെ ബേബീസിനെ നോക്കണ്ടല്ലോ, എന്തെങ്കിലും അവര് ഈവൻ കെയർടേക്കർ പോലും വരത്തില്ല. അതാണ് ഒരു ഇഷ്യൂ ഉള്ളത്.
എനിക്ക് തോന്നുന്നു നമ്മൾ കൗൺസിൽ ചെയ്യുന്ന ടൈപ്പ് മാറ്റാനായിരിക്കും. ബേബീസ് ബെറ്റർ വിത്ത് ബ്രസ്റ്റ് ഫീഡ് എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞ് കൗൺസിൽ ചെയ്താൽ പ്രോബബ്ലി ഇത് ചെയ്യും. നമ്മൾ ആ റിസ്ക്, ഇൻഫെക്ഷൻ കുഞ്ഞിന് വരാൻ റിസ്ക് ഉണ്ടെന്ന്
കുട്ടിക്ക് വരുമോ എന്നുള്ള പേടിയാണ് അവർക്ക്. അപ്പൊ ഇല്ലാന്ന് നമുക്ക് പറയാൻ പറ്റത്തില്ലല്ലോ.
പക്ഷെ കുട്ടിക്ക് വന്നാലും ഒന്നും പറ്റില്ല എന്ന് പറയാമല്ലോ.
എനിക്ക് തോന്നുന്നു നമ്മളെ റണ്ണിങ് ഔട്ട് ഓഫ് ടൈം. ഒരുപാട് പേര് ചോദിക്കുന്നു. നമുക്ക്
ഒരു ക്വസ്റ്റ്യൻ കൂടെ, വൺ മോർ ക്വസ്റ്റ്യൻ. നഴ്സറിയിൽ കോവിഡ് പോസിറ്റീവ് ബേബിനെ നോക്കുമ്പോൾ ഫുൾ PPE കിറ്റ് നമ്മൾ ഉപയോഗിക്കണം എന്നുണ്ടോ?
റെക്കമെൻഡേഷൻ ഡെഫിനറ്റ്ലി ഫുൾ PPE ആണ്. കാരണം സക്ഷനും ഓക്സിജനും കൊടുക്കുന്നത് കാരണം. മെയിൻ തിങ് ഇസ് മാസ്ക്, N95 മാസ്കും വൈസറും മാൻഡേറ്ററി ആണ്. ബാക്കി എന്തിട്ടാലും ഇട്ടില്ലേലും ആ രണ്ട് കാര്യമാണ് ഏറ്റവും മാൻഡേറ്ററി.
ഇവര് ഫുൾ PPE ഇട്ടിട്ട് ഇവര് 4 മണിക്കൂർ അല്ലെങ്കിൽ 3 മണിക്കൂർ ആകുമ്പോഴേക്കും ശ്വാസം മുട്ടെന്ന് പറഞ്ഞിട്ട് പോകും. സ്റ്റാഫ് ഷോർട്ടേജ് വരുന്നത് അതുകൊണ്ടാണ് ചോദിച്ചത്.
മറ്റേത് രണ്ടുമാണ് മെയിൻ. One question is there any role for HCQ for prevention? The government of India is recommending, ICMR is recommending HCQ for prevention. Anybody is coming in contact with a positive patient, first day 400 milligram BED, adu kazhinju 400 milligram once daily for 3 weeks. If it is a patient bystander ആണെങ്കിൽ, അതല്ലെങ്കിൽ ഹെൽത്ത് കെയർ വർക്കർ ആണെങ്കിൽ for 7 weeks. It's recommended.
മാഡം HCQന്റെ പ്രൊഫൈലാക്സിസ് പറഞ്ഞത് ഒന്നുകൂടെ റിപ്പീറ്റ് ചെയ്യാവോ മാഡം?
400 milligram BD for day 1 ആദ്യത്തെ ദിവസം. അത് കഴിഞ്ഞ് 400 milligram വീക്ക്ലി വൺസ് എടുത്താണ്. വീക്ക്ലി വൺസ് ഫോർ 7 weeks. നമ്മളൊരു ഹെൽത്ത് കെയർ വർക്കർ ആണെങ്കിൽ 7 weeks. അപ്പൊ ഇപ്പൊ അവരുടെ റെക്കമെൻഡേഷൻ എന്ന് വെച്ചാൽ കോവിഡിൽ വർക്ക് ചെയ്യുന്ന എല്ലാ ഹെൽത്ത് കെയർ വർക്കറും കോവിഡ് ഹോസ്പിറ്റലില് നോൺ കോവിഡില് വർക്ക് ചെയ്യുന്ന ആൾക്കാരും കഴിക്കണം എന്നാണ് ICMR റെക്കമെൻഡേഷൻ. എല്ലാരും കഴിച്ചിട്ടില്ല, പക്ഷെ കഴിക്കണം എന്നാണ് അവരുടെ റെക്കമെൻഡേഷൻ. എടുക്കണം, ബേസ് ലൈൻ ECG എടുക്കണം. ചിലർക്ക് ഇറ്റ് ഈസ് അലർജിക് ഓൾസോ. So that also we need to know that it can cause allergy. അപ്പൊ അത് രണ്ടും അറിഞ്ഞുകൊണ്ട് വേണം ചെയ്യാൻ.
ഇപ്പൊ ബൈസ്റ്റാൻഡർ ആണെങ്കിൽ എത്ര വീക്സ് കൊടുക്കണമെന്നാ മാഡം?
3 weeks. 3 ആഴ്ച മതി. 3 ആഴ്ച.
താങ്ക് യു.